The wind doesn't howl in the highlands, not at first. It begins with a whisper that traces the stones, curling through moss-covered walls like a rumor long forgotten. It slips beneath the thatch and tugs at loose threads in a peasant's cloak. It brushes against rough wool and cracked hands and lingers in the silence after a breath. And on nights like this, when the moon is thin and low, the wind becomes the only voice that remembers. In the earliest hours, before the hearth has stirred, before boots meet mud or lips meet prayer, the village lies still. Just past the bend in a frostbitten valley, the stone cottages lean into one another, as if their shared weight might resist the chill that creeps from the mountain's edge. No fires burn yet. Only coals slumber, faint red eyes beneath the ash, waiting for a gentle hand to coax them back. This is where the story begins. Not in the castles, not in the scrolls, not in the memories of kings. But in the quiet hush of survival. In the breath that fogs the air as a child shuffles beneath a shared woolen blanket. In the groan of old timbers adjusting to another cold dawn. Outside, the frost clings to every surface, to buckets half filled with ice-crusted water, to tools left leaning on posts, to the tired cart that waits like a faithful mule. Even the crows delay their cawing. The world is frozen in prayer. You can hear the weight of winter pressing on the land. A sort of tension in the stillness. As though the trees themselves are holding their breath. Not because of fear, but because they've learned to wait. The oaks and the hawthorns, the bramble-bent fences and frost-slicked paths, they've all done this before. And they will again. Inside one of these cottages, a woman stirs. Her name is not known in any book. She didn't own land, and she didn't lead armies. But in this story, she matters. Because her life was not small, even if the world made it so. She is wrapped in a woolen shawl passed down from her grandmother, mended so many times it now carries a patchwork of years. Her fingers move with the muscle memory of necessity, kindling, flint, breath, flame. A faint orange glow begins to pulse against the stone. The warmth spreads slowly, not in temperature, but in spirit. A bit of light, flickering against the wall, gives shape to the room. The hanging herbs, now brittle with age. The iron pot, soot-stained and still half full from last night's barley. A pair of worn boots, drying on their sides. And near the door, wrapped tightly in wool, the curled shape of her son. The air still smells of smoke from days before. Smoke that clings to the hair, to the thatch, to memory. It is not a clean scent, but it is familiar. It smells of labor, of wood gathered one limb at a time, of fire coaxed from damp splinters and stubborn stone. Soon the others will wake. But for now, she is alone with the wind, and the wind does not ask questions. It simply moves. Through the cracks in the wood, past the shutters that never seal tight, across the threshold that holds more than just cold. It's an old wind. One that remembers battles and births. One that has kissed both kings and cattle. She listens to it, not with ears, but with a stillness passed down like an heirloom. In the highlands, wind is not just weather. It's a kind of language. And this morning, it carries no urgency. Only presence. The chickens will not peck the frost until midday. The hearth won't heat the room, only soften its edges. The barley stew will be stretched again, maybe with some turnip peel, maybe with snow melt. There is no surprise in this. Only rhythm. And that rhythm is what made it survivable. The calendar mattered little here. They knew the seasons by texture, not by name. Early winter, when the grass still fought. Deep winter, when even silence seemed brittle. The breaking, when mud replaced snow. The bloom, when the air tasted faintly of green again. But this was the middle. The coldest part. The long stretch of nothing. A door creaks. The boy stirs, his breath visible as he blinks. His first words are not words. They are glances. Questions spoken in shared struggle. And she answers with a nod, a slice of bread harder than wood, and a cup of warmth made from what was left of yesterday's tea. Outside, the wind carries on. It whistles low beneath the eaves, brushes against bare stone, curls around the edges of the world and vanishes into the mountains. Somewhere far off, another cottage does the same. Another woman, another fire. Another day beginning not with fanfare, but with a breath. A sound. A stirring. And if you listen close, really close, you might hear it. The quiet anthem of those who endure. Not because they are strong in the way songs describe, but because they know no other way. That is where the story begins. In wind and stone. In silence and bread. In waking without complaint. In Scotland, in the coldest hours, when nothing sings, except the wind on stone. The hills of medieval Scotland were not just shaped by wind and rain. They were sculpted by older forces, by ice, and time, and the weight of footsteps pressed into peat long before names were written down. These were hills that had seen blood soak into the moss, then snow cover the scar. Hills that bore the silence of the forgotten, and the stubbornness of those who refused to be. There is a kind of hush here, even now. As though the land itself has agreed to speak only when necessary. The rocks do not boast. The trees do not sing. The rivers run slow and careful, weaving through valleys as if remembering every battle ever fought nearby. Long before borders hardened into lines, and clans etched their crests into stone, this landscape was a shifting language of survival. No single path was safe. No road could be trusted to remain clear. What wasn't frozen might be stolen. What wasn't stolen might starve. And yet, they lived here. They built their homes not as monuments, but as defiance. Stone pressed into stone, roofs laid low to shield against wind, doors narrow and thick. A peasant's cottage was not meant to impress. It was meant to last, just barely. And that was enough. Imagine walking across the moor at first light. The sky barely pink, the ground still hard with frost. You're wrapped in coarse wool, the kind that itches even after years of wear. Your boots are leather, cracked and repaired with twine. Beneath your feet, the land sighs, not in comfort, but in cold memory. This place is quiet not from peace, but from exhaustion. It has seen too much. Raiders from the north. Lords from the south. Wolves, both the four-legged and the crowned. And yet, even in that, the land remains. That's what the people learned from it. The ice didn't just shape the land, it shaped them. Their spines curled like bent branches, not from weakness but from the weight they carried. Water was fetched from frozen streams with numb hands. Firewood was gathered not in armfuls, but in single sticks, pried from stubborn roots and dried beside the hearth like treasure. Every act was a prayer, even if no one called it that. And so, in this harsh terrain, their lives found rhythm. One such man, whose name the world no longer remembers, once stood before a ridge and stared into the mist. He didn't wonder what lay beyond. He knew. Another ridge. Another stretch of rock and thorn and frozen earth. But still, he looked, not for escape, but for understanding. This was his world, and to know it was to survive it. He would return home with arms full of kindling and a thin rabbit from the snare. His wife, hunched over the fire, would nod without a word. The child beside her would stir the pot, not out of curiosity, but to keep the oats from sticking. Nothing was done for luxury. Everything had a reason. Even the silence. Especially the silence. The hills guarded that silence like a secret. No one shouted here. Voices were low, meant for those close enough to matter. If you cried, it was into the wind. If you laughed, it was at night, when the danger couldn't hear. Joy existed, of course, but it was folded into necessity. A thicker blanket. A stew that lasted 2 days. A land that lived through its first snow. And beneath all that, history. Not the kind sung by bards, or etched in illuminated texts. but the kind carried in the bones. In the way a man walked with one shoulder lower than the other, from years of chopping wood. In the calluses on a woman's palms from grinding grain between stone. In the way children knew, without being told, not to speak when the wind shifted. For war was always nearby. Even in sleep, they knew it. Clans feuded over patches of grazing land, over whose sheep had wandered, over oaths remembered too clearly or forgotten too soon. And so, the cold was not the only enemy. Steel was just as unforgiving. But unlike kings, the ice did not lie. It did not make promises. It simply came, slow, creeping, patient. And when it arrived, it asked nothing of you but everything you had. Still, they stayed. Not out of ignorance, but because this was home. These stones had been lifted by their fathers. These fences mended by mothers' hands. This ground had taken the blood of their kin and turned it into something worth growing, barley, oats, a breath of green in the spring. Leaving would be like forgetting. And so, the land taught them endurance. When winter thickened, they did not curse it. They studied it. Not with books, but with bone-deep attention. The way the sheep clustered meant snow. The crack in the wood beam meant frost would thicken. The silence of birds meant a storm. They read the land the way others read scripture. And sometimes, they survived because of it. It's easy, now, to romanticize such hardship. To picture it in candlelight and soft music. But to live it, to truly live it, was to wake with the ache of another day before you. To know that the firewood might not last, that the stew might be thin, that the war horn might sound before sunrise. And yet, to rise anyway. To face the wind. To mend the cloak. To sharpen the blade. To cradle the child. In that, there was dignity. Not the kind that earns statues, but the kind that endures in silence. The kind carved into the hills, whispered by the frost, carried by the breath of the people who would not bend, only bow, briefly, to the cold, before rising again. Because this was Scotland. And this was winter. And this was life. The morning didn't arrive with a song. It arrived in smoke. Before the light stretched fully across the hills, before the frost on the window had even begun to melt, the air inside a Scottish croft was already thick with peat smoke. It didn't sting the eyes anymore. It clung like an old shawl, familiar, persistent, warm in its own rough way. The croft was a single room. 4 stone walls. A roof that sloped just enough to shrug off the snow. One small, greased-hide window, not for beauty, not even for the view, but to let in what little light could be spared. Light was not a luxury here. Nor was space. Everything had a place. And most things had more than one use. The hearth was not simply where food was cooked, it was the soul of the home. Its glow was the line between life and the cold that waited just outside the door. The peat, brown bricks cut from the bog in the warmer months and stacked to dry under the weak sun, burned slow. It gave little flame, but it gave just enough warmth. And it gave smoke. Smoke that curled upward, filled the rafters, blackened the ceiling, and whispered quietly into everything. The scent of peat was everywhere, in the wool of the blankets, in the stitching of clothes, even in the child's hair. And when someone left the croft, the scent went with them. It was a signature. A quiet badge of survival. The morning began with silence. Not out of peace, but habit. Speaking wasted breath. And besides, the body wasn't ready for words yet. Limbs were stiff from the cold. Fingers curled tight in sleep, needed time to remember they were hands again. The mother was first to rise. Not with a start, but with a slow, practiced ache. She didn't need light. Her hands knew where everything was. The pot. The cloth. The coals buried deep in the hearth, still holding heat from the night before. She coaxed them back to life with a breath and a stick of kindling. The flame stuttered, but it returned. She wrapped a shawl over her shoulders and stirred the pot from last night, oats and water. It would be thinner this morning, but it was food. And warm. Warmth was everything. The child stirred in the bed, still tucked beside the father, both curled together for heat. Beds were not separate in a croft. They were built into the wall, box beds with wooden doors that shut out the cold, like closets for sleeping. And when the door creaked open, it wasn't just the air that spilled out, but the breath of the people within, little clouds catching the faint light. A yawn, muffled. A cough, dry. No one complained. Complaining used energy. The father rubbed his hands together near the fire, not for comfort, but to loosen the joints. There was always work to be done. Wood to be split. Nets to be mended. Traps to be checked. Even in winter, especially in winter, idleness was dangerous. He pulled on his tunic, thick with patches, and tied a length of cord around his waist. His boots, stiff from yesterday's dampness, resisted his foot. But he got them on. The child sat at the fire now, hands outstretched, eyes still fogged with sleep. No one spoke yet. Not out of coldness, but reverence. Morning was like church, a place for quiet tasks and steady breath. Words would come later, once the day had truly begun. Outside, the sky was still more night than day. But the frost was beginning to blush at the edges. The croft door, made of rough timber and animal hide, creaked open, and the cold rushed in like a forgotten guest. The father stepped out first, greeted not by fanfare, but by wind and the crunch of his own footsteps on frozen earth. From here, the land rolled out like an old wool blanket, worn, patched, beloved. Low stone walls traced the contours of fields now stiff with ice. A few sheep, bundled in their own silence, moved slowly through the frost. Their breath hung in the air like smoke. The croft sat low to the earth. Not for beauty, but to hide from the wind. Every stone had been chosen for its purpose. Every gap stuffed with moss or mud. This was not architecture. This was survival. Inside, the mother ladled out the oats. One bowl, then another, and one smaller still. She didn't taste it. She didn't need to. It would be enough. Just barely. As the family sat together on low stools, their backs to the wind outside and their faces to the fire, there was a moment, small, but whole, where the world paused. The peat smoke rose. The frost waited. And the day, brutal as it might become, had not yet asked too much of them. Here, in this moment, they existed. Not as heroes or victims, not as names in a ledger or numbers on a map. But as people. Breathing, eating, surviving. Quietly. Always quietly. This was a morning in a Scottish croft. This was how the day began. And it would have to be enough. The fire had long since burned down to whispers of ash. The croft's single-roomed body breathed cold into itself like a sleeping animal without fur. On a winter morning in medieval Scotland, you did not rise because you were rested. You rose because the cold demanded it. And so they did. One by one. A family wrapped in layered linens, rough wool, and exhaustion. The eldest child stirred first, not because he was brave, but because that was how it always was. Eldest feet were meant for the worst of mornings. Bare feet touched frozen dirt, and it was like stepping onto stone from another world, numbing, biting, waking. Their home had no flooring, only the earth beneath. When rain had come months ago, it had seeped in. And then it froze. Now, the ground held that damp, icy memory with cruel precision. It wasn't frostbitten so much as it was frost itself. And the child, 7, maybe 8, winced but did not cry. Crying used energy. Energy meant warmth. Warmth was for keeping. Each morning was a quiet war with cold. No speeches, no battle cries. Just the rustle of threadbare blankets, the groan of joints too young to sound like that, the breath visible in the dim dawn light. It hung there, white and brief, like a spirit that would not stay. His mother followed, wrapping her cloak tight around her waist with rope, knotting it in a way that was more memory than thought. Her face was stone, not from hardness, but from years of winter shaping her the way water shapes cliffs. Her fingers, red and cracked, pulled a kettle from the hearth, poured in what little remained from yesterday's snowmelt. Water and oats. No salt left. But the oats would thicken, and that was enough. There was no fire yet. Not because they didn't want it. Because fuel was precious. Peat had to be dug and dried in warmer months, and now it had to stretch, one chunk, maybe two, per day. And always saved for evening when the cold returned full force, like a beast coming home to roost in the thatch. The children dressed in silence. No socks, just wool wraps twisted around legs, tied with string, and tucked beneath tunics. Their fingers trembled not because they were afraid, but because fingers that cold always trembled. And still, they helped. One sister wrapped another's wrap tighter. One brother held a cup while another blew into it. Warmth, shared, was always more than warmth hoarded. Outside, the wind muttered its old, cruel song. The kind that crept beneath doors and through the thin cracks of old stone. It rattled shutters that barely held. It scolded the roof like a disappointed elder. The cold wasn't weather. It was presence. A member of the household, unwelcome but unrelenting. The father was last to stir. Not from laziness. From caution. His body had worked through the dark, muscles sore from cutting wood, mending the roof, slaughtering the pig. The cold took energy from even the stillest sleep. He sat up, slowly. Hands to face. Breathing against them, as if warmth could be summoned from breath alone. He looked at his family as if counting them. Not in number, but in condition. Who was limping? Who coughed in the night? Who had that pale color in their cheeks that meant fever might come? He did not speak. But he saw. And that was his way. Breakfast, when it came, was a whisper of food. Oats, thin. A crust of bread dipped into the water to soften it. No butter. That had run out weeks ago. No honey. Bees didn't hum in the snow. But no one complained. Not once. Complaining took warmth from the room. And then, the boots. One pair shared between two sons. They took turns, one walking to the well, the other staying by the hearth. The boots were old. Hand-stitched from cowhide. Cracked along the seams. Repaired with twine and determination. The one who wore them always moved faster, not out of greed, but guilt. The women stepped outside in slippers made from cloth scraps wrapped around their feet and tied with twigs. They didn't last long. But it was enough to gather frost-covered herbs from the garden edge, enough to check the chickens if the fox hadn't gotten in. Enough to return with cheeks red and hands burning from cold that never fully left the skin. By midday, the sun was barely there. A pale disk behind cloud and fog. And still, the work continued. The girls scraped the inside of the crofts' walls with bones, keeping moss and mold from claiming it. The boys gathered snow and melted it over small stones, clean water for tomorrow. The mother mended wool socks that didn't exist, because dreaming about warmth was its own kind of survival. When the day leaned toward evening, and the shadows thickened, the peat was placed into the hearth. The crackle was quiet, like a memory. Smoke rose, and the croft warmed, but only slightly. Enough to sit close, and wrap arms around knees. Enough to make shadow play on the wall. Enough to believe in sleep. There were no stories tonight. No energy left for tales. Just the sound of wind again, brushing against the thatch like an old friend knocking. Just the rhythm of breath, slow, steady, shared. And the dirt beneath their feet remained cold. Always cold. But by now, they no longer noticed. Because it was theirs. And they had survived another day. The fire was low again. Just enough to give a faint, ember-colored glow to the beams above. The croft, made of stone and stubbornness, still held the cold in its ribs. Yet there was a moment, before anyone spoke or moved, where you could feel something older than frost lingering in the room. Something heavier than silence. It was memory. The kind that doesn't belong to just one person. The kind that sits between generations like a chair never pulled away from the hearth. Outside, the snow clung to every branch like ash. Winter in medieval Scotland had its own time. And in that slow crawl of days, there came other burdens besides the cold. Namely, the crown. The king, whoever he was, wherever he sat, never entered the croft. He would never smell the smoke-stained air or taste the saltless oat broth. Yet his reach was as real as the roof over their heads. Long and quiet. It came not with soldiers most days, but with scribes and seals and tacksmen who knew how to smile without kindness. A knock on the door was always felt before it was heard. And when it came in late winter, it carried a different kind of chill. Taxes. They called them foodduties, or crown rents. But the family never used the words. They just called it the taking. Because that was what it was. A portion of grain, a bundle of wool, even the pig that had been fed carefully since autumn, gone. Taken in the name of the king. Not out of cruelty, but out of custom. Custom so old no one questioned its shape anymore. Like snow, it simply fell. The family didn't speak ill of the king, not aloud. That was dangerous. But they felt him in the way the father tensed when counting the sacks in the loft. In the mother's pause before spinning wool, calculating how much she'd have to give away. In the way the oldest child learned to close their mouth when the name of the king was spoken by passing monks or messengers. Reverence was survival. Once, many years ago, there had been rebellion. Not in this croft. But nearby. A man from another glen, a cooper's son, had said no. Had refused the tax, boarded his doors, and swore he'd serve no lord. For a week, he was spoken of with awe. Courage, they called it. Fire in the blood. Then came the men in iron. Not knights with banners, but men paid in coin, with cudgels and rope. They took what was owed, burned what was not, and hung the cooper's son from his own tree. They left him there as a warning. Not to frighten the village, but to remind them of the order of things. Since then, there were no more rebellions. Just small acts of resistance too quiet to be noticed. The family had its ways. The mother would set aside a gift for the taxman, a small jar of preserved berries or a carving from the children, something humble. Something human. It softened the taking. The father, when no one was looking, sometimes buried a small pouch of grain under the floorboards. Just enough to be a secret. Not for greed, but for safety. In case the next winter was worse. In case the taking came with more hands. Even the children knew. When they played, the king was never the hero. He was a cloud in the distance, or a shadow on the hill. They didn't hate him. But they feared the silence that followed his name. The monks came sometimes, too. They bore scrolls and crosses and spoke of divine right. That God had chosen the king, and obedience was holy. The family nodded. They offered bread. But their prayers, whispered at night, asked not for loyalty, but for mercy. Still, there were those who remembered better kings. The grandmother, long since gone, had once spoken of a ruler who rode out in the snow to deliver food himself. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The story had warmth in it. It lived like a candle in the mind. Now, all they had was parchment laws and coin tallies and words written in ink that no one in the croft could read. But they felt the meaning, clear as wind through the cracks. You owe. You always owe. One winter, the taxman did not come. Snow too deep, they said. Or roads too dangerous. The family held their breath. Ate a little more. sang a little louder. But they knew it was not a gift. It was a delay. When he arrived in spring, he asked for double. And still, they survived. Not with swords. Not with fire. But with the same things they used to survive winter itself: stillness, patience, and each other. Sometimes the father would sit by the fire, tracing patterns in the ash with a stick. Quiet rebellion, he called it. Not of violence, but of memory. He remembered every bushel, every lamb, every weight of wool taken. And he remembered who had smiled as they took it. The mother, when spinning thread, would tell tales of ancient warriors who had fought kings and lived. Not to teach hatred, but to remind her children that history was not only written in castles. And once, only once, the oldest son carved a small crown into the underside of the table. Then struck a line through it. No one noticed. But somehow, the croft felt warmer that night. Because even in the quietest places, even in the coldest years, the shadow of the crown did not fall without resistance. Sometimes, that resistance looked like silence. Sometimes, it looked like hiding a handful of oats in the corner of the room. And sometimes, it looked like love, of land, of family, of mornings when the tacksmen didn't knock. They were never asked if they wanted to play the game. The crofters and herders, the peat cutters and mothers, the ones who walked barefoot across frozen fields with silent mouths, they were born into it. The game had no beginning they could remember and no end they dared imagine. It simply was. Like snow, like wind, like winter. The rules were spoken softly but enforced harshly. You lived not on your land, you lived on the Lord's land. And for the honor of staying alive there, you paid not only in coin or barley, but in obedience. In hours. In the unspoken curve of your back after a long day spent working someone else's field. There was always a Lord. Even if you never saw him. Even if he lived in a stone manor miles away, or rode past only once in a decade on a gray horse that looked bored by everything it saw. His name was known in the village like a whispered spell. Said rarely, but felt daily. He might be called Mac something or Don or Laird of the Glen. But he was never called yours. You didn't need to see the Lord to know him. You saw his presence in the walls built around the best grazing land. You saw it in the way the forest was cut only to the line where his deer wandered, and no farther. You felt him in the hush that fell over the room when his messenger arrived, scroll in hand, seal still warm with wax. The relationship was called tenancy. A word that made it sound like you'd signed up for something. Like you'd asked for the privilege of giving away your harvest, your wool, your sons for his wars. But there had been no signing. Only being born into the system. A web so old that no one remembered when it was spun. A game of power and silence. And yet, somehow, life persisted under that shadow. Every croft had its own rhythm, its own quiet rebellion. The family would do what was required, yes, they would shear the sheep and carry the bushels and kneel when the steward passed, but they always kept something for themselves. A trick passed down from grandmothers. A way to survive within the rules by pretending you didn't notice them. Sometimes it was as simple as planting herbs behind the croft, in a small plot just past where the tax collector usually counted. Sometimes it meant pretending that the lamb born last week hadn't survived the night, only to raise it in a hidden pen behind the hill. Not out of dishonesty. Out of necessity. Because the game never stopped changing. One season, the rent might be in oats. The next, in coin. Then, suddenly, in the labor of your oldest son, conscripted to clear brush for the Lord's new hunting grounds. If you failed to pay, there was no sympathy. Only eviction. Or worse. The worst was the reallocation. If a neighboring tenant proved more loyal, more productive, more favored, you might find your croft handed over to them. No trial. No discussion. One morning you'd be cutting firewood, and by evening, a new family would be walking across your threshold. And so you learned to smile when the steward visited. To bow, not too low, but just enough. To speak softly but not stupidly. The father in the croft knew this dance well. He had watched his uncle lose everything after refusing to pay an extra sack of barley. That same uncle had later been found in the forest, frozen beside a fallen log, with a smile still carved on his face. Some said it was defiance. Others said madness. The children didn't learn the rules in school. They learned by watching. They saw how their mother offered the biggest eggs to the Lord's men, even when they were hungry. They heard how their grandfather, once proud, now spoke only in riddles when asked about the old days, days when clans had fought back, when land was won with swords and not signatures. Some still believed in the old rights. That the land should belong to those who worked it. That the glens and hills and mossy stones remembered hands more than names. But belief was a dangerous thing. So most just kept playing. There was a strange kind of dignity in it, too. Not submission, but endurance. To keep a fire going under someone else's chimney. To raise sheep you didn't own. To carve spoons, sew tunics, harvest peat, and still find moments of joy in the middle of it all, that was strength. The lords rarely understood that. They saw tenants as pieces. Pawns in a game. Names on parchment. Rent owed and debts forgiven with conditions. But the people in the crofts, they had stories. Of the one time the Lord's son fell from his horse and was nursed back to health by a woman with nothing but broth and song. Of how an old tenant had once tricked a steward into thinking his cow had birthed twins every year for 10 years, when in truth, he just borrowed a neighbor's calf during inspections. Of a girl who sang a song so sweet at Beltane that the steward gave back an extra sack of flour without saying why. These weren't victories. Not really. But they were moments. And in a game you couldn't win, sometimes all you could do was refuse to lose completely. Even if no one remembered your name. Even if the snow buried your croft and your bones alike. The land would remember. It always did. It always began with a bell. Not a song, not a sunbeam, not even a rooster, but a deep iron voice carried on the mist. A sound too large for any one village to own. It traveled farther than voices, deeper than stories. The bell meant more than worship. It meant order. Every Sunday, every holy day, every time the calendar of saints demanded attention, the bell would echo across the frost-rimmed moor and through the ribs of the old stone kirk. It echoed off thatched rooftops. It found the inside of your chest even when you were trying to pretend you hadn't heard it. The bell didn't ask you to come. It expected you. Even in winter. Especially in winter. Because the church was many things, a shelter, a scripture, a sentence, a savior. For the peasant living on borrowed land and borrowed time, it was one of the few constants left. It gave a rhythm to life that didn't depend on the weather or the whims of a distant lord. It gave answers, even when they were terrifying. You went because everyone went. You went even if your feet were blistered from cutting peat all week. You went even if your belly was empty and your patience thinner than the frost on your window. You went with your head low and your breath steaming from cracked lips, trudging past the same stones your father had passed, your mother had blessed, and your neighbors would one day lie beneath. The inside of the kirk was cold, but not lifeless. The walls were made of stone, but not mute. Each one echoed centuries of whispered confessions and muffled coughs. There were no grand cathedrals here, no soaring stained glass or velvet cushions. The benches were rough. The air carried the scent of damp wool, burning tallow, and breath. But it was holy, not because it was beautiful, but because it endured. The priest stood like a pillar in a robe that had seen more seasons than many of his flock. His voice rose, not in fire and fury, but in the weary cadence of someone tasked with holding fragile souls together. Latin spilled out first, foreign and weighty, followed by the Gaelic that bent softer, wrapping around ears used to the wind. To live in medieval Scotland was to live under two crowns, one temporal, one eternal. If the king ruled your field, the church ruled your thoughts. And for most, that was a fair trade. The church told them suffering was noble. That hunger was holy if it brought you closer to Christ. That frostbitten fingers could still clasp in prayer, and that death, always lurking, was not the end but a doorway. People needed that. Needed something that spoke of meaning while they watched a child cough through the night or buried another winter's dead beneath the stone cross no one could afford to carve. But faith was not only comfort. It was also watching. You were known, not by name, but by attendance. By how low you bowed. By how much you gave, or didn't give, in the offering plate, whether it was coin, egg, or threadbare cloth. The kirk kept a ledger, of sorts. Not always written. But remembered. And memory was as sharp a tool as any sword. Those who missed too often, who questioned too loudly, or who whispered old songs not found in Scripture, they were noticed. And sometimes they were punished. Not always by lash or law, but by isolation. A seat moved farther from the fire. A blessing withheld. A look from the priest that carried the weight of judgment more than any sermon ever could. Still, people came. Because there was warmth in the ritual. There was communion, in the truest sense. To stand among neighbors, all equally chilled and equally burdened, was to feel, if only for an hour, that you were not alone. The songs helped too. Simple chants sung through chattering teeth. Verses half remembered but deeply felt. The hymns hung in the air like the mist outside, catching on shawls and in the lashes of young girls still learning to fear and to believe in equal measure. The church gave more than rules. It gave stories. Of saints who survived starvation, of martyrs who welcomed the cold as penance. Of Mary, whose quiet suffering reminded many mothers of their own. Of Job, who lost everything and still prayed. In those stories, people found themselves. Found echoes of their own bleak fields and prayers mumbled into wool blankets. And then there were the relics. Small, strange things. A bone wrapped in cloth. A nail that might have come from a holy cart, or simply from a very old barn. They didn't need to be authentic to be believed. Faith didn't require evidence. Only repetition. A certain stone near the font that cured fevers. A wooden carving above the door that protected from wolves. Not all of it was church doctrine. But the priest never stopped them. Because he, too, was part of the land. Not above it, but within it. And he knew that faith mixed with folklore like peat mixed with smoke, indistinguishable but necessary. The church offered guidance, yes. But it also gave shape. A baptism meant the child had a name even if the family had no inheritance. A wedding meant two hands clasped with witness, even if there was no feast. A funeral meant someone spoke your name after you were gone. Even if the bell didn't ring just for you. And in the darkest parts of the year, when storms sealed doors and cold crept under bones, sometimes the only light came from the memory of the bell. It meant the kirk still stood. That prayer still echoed. That someone, somewhere, was speaking your name, or at least God's, into the cold. In the low light of a winter dawn, before breath had warmed the inside of the hut and before the first oat was stirred into porridge, there came the ritual of dressing, not in luxury or style, but in layers meant to defy the frost. Clothing in medieval Scotland wasn't fashion. It was survival stitched in silence. There were no closets. No chests overflowing with options. There was one tunic, maybe two if you were blessed beyond the usual. And each piece told a quiet story, of hands that spun, sheep that shivered, and nights where warmth was more valuable than bread. The first layer was always wool. Not the soft, brushed kind from distant looms, but coarse and honest, scraped from the backs of sheep raised on bitter heather and wind. You could feel the grass in the weave, feel the land itself woven into the threads. It scratched at the skin. But it held heat like cupped hands. Tunics were square-cut and simple, falling to the knees or lower, depending on how many seasons they had seen. The hems were never even. The threads were always frayed. Children wore tunics that had once fit their fathers, sleeves rolled or stitched tight with leftover yarn. Belts made from braided flax or worn leather gathered the shape, but loosely. Too tightly, and the cloth might tear under strain. Over that, another tunic if there was one. Then a cloak, always wool, always heavy. It doubled as a blanket at night. It caught snow like a rooftop, then dried stiff near the hearth. Colors were humble. Browns like the peat earth. Dull greens faded from old dye pots. Grays like mist or stone. Occasionally, a blue, rare and washed out, worn as a trace of dignity more than display. Most clothing came from the women's hands. Their days were full of spinning and carding, of soaking and dyeing, of bending over a spindle or threading bone needles through homespun fabric. They didn't sign their work. But every tunic, every sock with an uneven stitch, was a testament to the quiet hours between chores and childbirth. And when the wind blew so hard the doors had to be braced, those same women mended, hunched over candlelight, pulling threads from old garments to patch the newer ones. A stitch in time didn't save 9, it saved 1, and that was enough. Gloves were a luxury. Most wore mittens if they had them, thumbed and thick, passed between siblings, often missing their pairs. Some wrapped rags around their fingers, dipped in tallow to repel the wet. Fingertips turned blue anyway. Numbness became part of the morning. Hats were essential. Caps made of wool or lined with sheepskin. Linen coifs tied under the chin, kept snug to the scalp. Women wore wimples, not as symbols of piety but as shields against the wind. When they walked outdoors, scarves wrapped twice, hoods drawn tight, eyes squinting through the folds. Boots, when they existed, were stitched from old hide, often resoled with wood or bark. More commonly, feet were wrapped in cloth, then slipped into shoes made from layered wool and stiffened with fat. In snow, straw was added inside, changed daily, if they had enough. Wet feet meant sickness. And sickness in winter could become death before spring. Bones were used too. Antler needles. Bone buttons. Horn toggles that fastened cloaks tight against the neck. Everything had a second life. A broken buckle became a clasp. A snapped belt became a strap for firewood. Nothing was discarded. Not because of thrift, but because there was no choice. Children wore whatever could be cobbled together. Sometimes shirts so large they dragged in the snow. Sometimes nothing but a tunic and bare legs, reddened and raw. Babies were swaddled in rags and wool scraps, wrapped so tight they could barely move, not from custom, but from fear of the cold leaking in through a mist fold. And yet, there was grace in the layering. A kind of humble elegance in how one cloth was draped, in the way a mother would adjust her son's scarf before he went to feed the hens. There were no mirrors. But there was pride. In a clean hem. In a garment patched with steady hands. In wool brushed smooth by the same fingers that kneaded dough and braided hair. Ceremonial clothes existed, though rarely worn. Kept in chests or hidden between bedding. A finer cloak with a clasp carved by a grandfather's hand. A linen dress bleached with lye and worn once, for a wedding, or perhaps a funeral. When those clothes emerged, it meant the world had shifted. A joining. A parting. A holy day. The ordinary garments, though, those carried the weight of daily life. They smelled of smoke and salt and skin. They held stories in their seams. Where a tear had been mended, there was a memory, of the chase through the trees, or the slip by the frozen creek. And the act of dressing, each morning, became a ritual of resistance. Against the frost. Against the hunger. Against the silence that so often crept in with the dark. Each thread was a defiance. Each layer a shield. And so they clothed themselves, not in style, but in stubbornness. Not in silk, but in strength. They dressed with the understanding that warmth was not just a matter of temperature. It was a thing built thread by thread, hour by hour, gesture by gesture. A cloak placed over a child's shoulder. A mitten shared in the sheep pen. A scarf tied tighter by a hand that trembled. Wool, bone, and cold air. That's what they wore. That's what kept them. That's what whispered, even in the deepest frost, "You are not undone." They say hunger sharpens memory. And perhaps that's why the memory of food, or the lack of it, clung like mist to the mind of every crofter in medieval Scotland. It wasn't that meals were scarce in the catastrophic sense every day, but rather that the same meal, the same thin sustenance, repeated itself so often that your mind almost forgot it existed at all. A bowl of porridge. Another bowl of porridge. And sometimes, when luck and livestock permitted, a bit of onion stirred in, a few slices of root or herbs, and if the stars aligned, a droplet of milk. But mostly, it was oats, water and oats, boiled down into a gruel that could be eaten hot or left cold for later. It filled the belly, if not the soul. The oat was not just food. It was survival. Hardy enough to grow in Scotland's poor, acidic soils and short growing seasons, it was cultivated in little patches around crofts and manors alike. Families guarded their sacks of oats like treasure, doled out carefully, meal by meal, day by day. In the early light, before the mist had lifted, someone would blow on the embers of last night's fire. Stir the coals. Add a few damp bits of peat. Then, with stiff fingers and sleep-heavy eyes, they'd set a pot to boil. It wasn't a feast. It wasn't ever a feast. But it was something warm, something steady. Children were raised on it, the taste of it becoming synonymous with winter and with home. They'd hold their wooden bowls in calloused hands, squatting near the hearth. No table, no chairs, just a circle of warmth and the careful clinking of spoons. The meal might be accompanied by silence, or it might be interrupted by soft coughs, the crackle of fire, or the rasp of someone mumbling a morning prayer. And then came the onions, sharp, fierce little bulbs that grew in the cracks of hard soil. If you had onions, you were doing well enough. Not well, exactly, but not starving. A sliced onion could flavor a pot for days. When you had more than one, you might roast them over a flame or mash them with oats, imagining for a moment that it was something grander, something richer, something rare. Sometimes, there was a stew. But calling it stew was a kindness. More often, it was water seasoned with whatever could be found. Some wild nettles, if it was spring. A bone, boiled long past the point of flavor. A turnip that had kept through the frost. Even then, you might eat it knowing there was little nourishment, but taking comfort in the warmth and the ritual. Meat was not common. Salt pork, when it existed, was hoarded for holy days or sickness. Rabbits were hunted, and when you caught one, it was a gift not just of food but of stories, a tale to tell while the meat cooked over fire, the smell sharp and tantalizing. Birds were rarer still. A pigeon, perhaps. Or if you were desperate and clever, you might trap a crow. And you'd eat it too. Eggs came when hens were warm enough to lay, and even then, the eggs were often traded or sold before they were eaten. A boiled egg might be shared between 3 or 4 mouths. The yolk, split with a thumb, parceled out in tiny bites. A treasure. Then there was bread, coarse, black bread baked in clay or stone ovens, sometimes mixed with bits of barley or mashed peas to make it stretch. It was tough and sometimes sour, but it could be dipped in milk or ale if you were lucky. For many, it was the only thing close to a luxury they would know. Children gnawed on heels of old loaves until their gums bled. Women tucked bits into aprons to carry into the field. Bread was both a gift and a grindstone. You had to work for it, wait for it, pray for it. And what wasn't there? That was a long list. No spices, unless you lived near trade routes or the manor. No sugar, no pepper, no butter unless you owned the cow. No tomatoes, no potatoes, both still centuries away. No abundance. No excess. Not even variety. It was the absence that shaped you. The way your tongue got used to blandness, the way your body adjusted to meager portions, the way a festival feast could reduce you to tears. Because food was not about flavor, it was about endurance. Water, drawn from cold wells, flavored with the smoke of the hearth. Ale, weak and watery, brewed thick with grains and sometimes honey. Milk, if the cow had calved, thin and blue-gray in winter. Every sip, a negotiation with time and season. Even hunger itself had a rhythm. The growl in the belly became background noise. Skipping meals wasn't a hardship, it was routine. And yet, there was always something beautiful in the act of sharing. If one person had a little more, they'd pass it quietly to a child, or to someone older, someone tired. No words, just a nod. An understanding. Meals were moments of togetherness, of hope. You sat with others in the same dark, cold room, hands wrapped around the same kind of bowl, and you knew, here, at least, there was warmth. A flicker of light. A full breath. So when we speak of medieval Scotland, don't ask what they feasted on. Ask how they endured. Not through abundance. Not through spice or sweetness or plenty. But through repetition. Through resilience. Through the simple act of waking each day and making another pot of oats. And if you can imagine the taste, not in richness, but in memory, then you, too, are sitting by the fire. You, too, are wrapped in wool and watching the mist from your breath curl into the rafters. And you, too, know what it means to eat what little there is, together. They sat shoulder to shoulder, drawn close by necessity, not only love. The hearth, a modest hollow scoop from stone and earth, crackled with a reluctant flame, barely enough to warm the bottom of the iron pot that hung from a soot-stained hook. Smoke curled upward in slow, ghostly ribbons, searching for escape through a small vent above. But in winter, even the smoke seemed reluctant to leave. The fire was never hot enough, and yet they clung to it. It was not just about warmth. It was about presence. The glow of the embers painted their cheeks with color where frost had drained it. The family didn't speak much, there wasn't the breath for it. But their silence wasn't empty. It was shared. Layered. Like the blankets patched from old tunics, too thin to be called warm, but too important to discard. Mother stirred the pot slowly. A thin gruel. Oats if they were lucky. Bits of onion, maybe a knob of turnip. Salt, if they had remembered to ration it. The children didn't ask what was in it. They didn't ask because they already knew, because when you grow up hungry, you learn the shape of disappointment. Still, the smell, faint and smoky, was enough to make their stomachs twitch with hope. The father sat near the edge of the hearth, legs folded tightly under himself, arms wrapped across his chest. His hands were red and cracked, with dirt under the nails that wouldn't wash out no matter how hard he scrubbed. He watched the fire, not the pot. The flames danced in his eyes, reflected like a prayer he was too tired to voice. Outside, the wind howled like a restless spirit dragging its heels across the land. But inside, the thick mud walls held firm. Cold crept in through cracks near the floor, kissed bare ankles with icy breath, and nestled into bones. Yet still, this one small circle around the fire was its own fragile world, a pocket of warmth in a winter that felt endless. The baby whimpered. A soft sound, like a question with no answer. The eldest daughter, no more than 10, lifted the baby and tucked him into her lap, swaddling him tighter with a linen wrap that had once been white, now stained and fraying at the edges. She hummed something. Not a lullaby exactly, more of a rhythm, a pattern of sound that meant comfort even when the words had long been forgotten. They waited. Not for a feast, not even for fullness. They waited for enough. When the food was finally ladled into shallow wooden bowls, no one rushed. There was no gluttony in this home. Every bite was measured. Savored. Stretched across time like thin fabric over a drafty window. The children sipped with closed eyes. The mother blew gently across the surface of her bowl, though the food was never truly hot. And the father, with his silent stare, finally moved, lifting the spoon with reverence, as though the act of eating was not survival, but ceremony. Conversation was rare, but sometimes they spoke in murmurs. Not about dreams, they didn't risk those. Dreams could betray you. They spoke of the cow, whether she would calf this spring. Of the hens and how few eggs they had laid. Of the roof, and whether it would hold through another snow. They spoke of the ordinary. Because the ordinary was everything. Behind them, hanging from a wooden peg, was the family's single treasure, a long woolen cloak, too big for any child, too small for both adults at once. They took turns wearing it on bitter nights, passing it like a torch of warmth. Tonight, it was draped over a stool near the hearth to dry. Damp from the snow, heavy with the scent of smoke and livestock, it still held the shape of the last person who'd worn it. The mother leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. Her head tilted toward the fire like a sunflower bending toward light. The baby had fallen asleep in his sister's arms, soft breath fogging the air between them. The father reached out and pulled the small boy's blanket up over his toes. There was something holy about these nights, though they would never call it that. The church was far away, and the priest even farther. But in this quiet gathering, in the hush between bites and the flicker of flame against wall, there was something that could not be named but could be felt. An old truth. That life, even in its most brutal season, clings to itself. That warmth multiplies when shared. That hunger, when endured together, becomes less of a torment and more of a bond. The fire began to settle. No one moved to add more wood, it was too precious. Better to conserve it for morning, for when fingers would need to be thawed before tools could be held. They knew how to sleep cold, but not how to live without fire. The youngest son, a quiet boy with wide eyes and calloused feet, looked up at his father and whispered, "Will the snow melt soon?" The father did not answer right away. He looked into the coals as though they might hold the answer. Then, softly, he said, "It always does. Just not when we want it to." And that was enough. The boy nodded and pulled his knees up under his tunic, nestling closer to his sister. The night would be long. The fire would dim. The cold would press in like it always did. But for this one moment, they were together. A family. Not fighting winter, but surviving it. One breath, one bite, one heartbeat at a time. And in the soft silence that followed, broken only by the creak of wood and the hiss of ember, you could almost believe the worst had already passed. When the light had faded and even the fire dared only to flicker in faint orange glows, something else came alive in the croft, something older than kings, older than the church, older even than the walls that held the cold at bay. The stories. They did not arrive all at once. They never did. Like the sourdough starter kept wrapped in cloth by the hearth, these tales were living things, carried from tongue to ear, passed like bread between hungry hands. The Gaelic tongue, soft as lichen on stone, slow as smoke from peat, would stir first from the corner of the room. A grandfather's voice, cracked by cold and age, or a mother humming a phrase that wasn't quite song, but wasn't quite not. And then it would begin. A girl might ask, "Tell me the one about the black stag again." And her brother, curled beside her with feet tucked into the folds of their shared blanket, might add, "And the selkie who wore a man's coat." They always asked for the old ones. The strange ones. The stories that made no promise of logic or comfort but wrapped the night in meaning. The father might grunt, at first pretending reluctance, then clear his throat. His Gaelic came heavy, like stone doors opening. His words rounded, not sharp, older than the English tongue, deeper than the new prayers from the church. It was the language of hills, of burns, of sky and silence and wind. There once was a man, he would begin, who followed a trail of moss into the forest and found a tree that grew upside down. The children leaned in, not for the ending, they already knew it, but for the telling. For the way the voice moved like water over rock, slow and worn and certain. For the rhythm that hummed beneath the words, steady as a heart. They did not know they were being taught. But they were. Each story carried more than amusement. It carried names, old names, like Ruadri and Morag, that told them who they came from. It carried places, Loch Marie, the edge of Rannoch Moor, that marked the map of their belonging. It carried lessons too, buried like bones in the dirt: never make a bargain on a foggy morning, always feed the cow before yourself, the wind that whistles 3 times means someone is walking where no path should be. And always, there was the bread. It sat on a wooden board near the fire. Dark, flat, round. Oat bannocks, dry as dust unless dipped in broth. Sometimes stale, sometimes charred. But tonight, there was just enough. And it was passed hand to hand as the story unfurled. No one took too much. You did not, when the tale was still alive. Storytelling was not a performance. It was a sharing. A communal exhale after the long breath of day. Even the baby quieted at the sound, as if the words themselves wrapped him in warmth. The language, too, was a kind of cloak. Outside, the world wore other tongues. English in the market, Latin in the church, Scots in the mouths of men with weapons and power. But in here, in this circle of flickering firelight and old stones and older voices, Gaelic ruled. Not by force, but by endurance. By blood. It was a language that remembered. It remembered a time before boundaries were drawn with swords and signatures. It remembered a time when clans were kin, not armies. When land was walked, not owned. When names carried weight not because they belonged to nobles, but because they belonged to the hill you were born beside. In Gaelic, there were 5 words for mist. 7 for cold. 12 for the ways someone could be tired. It was not a poor man's tongue. It was a poet's tongue. And it fit their lives like wool fits winter, rough, but warm. As the father's voice drifted through the tale's turning, others would join in, not to interrupt, but to remind. To nudge the memory gently toward the right turn in the path. She gave him a sprig of rowan, the mother would murmur. With red berries, to keep the shadow spirits off, the daughter would add. And the story would continue, strengthened by many tongues. The fire crackled. The bread dwindled. The baby dozed. Still, the story wove on. Not every tale ended in triumph. Many did not. But they all ended with understanding. With that slow, warm pause when no one speaks, because everyone knows something important has just passed between them, even if they can't say what. Sometimes the stories were short, just a few breaths long. A ghost glimpsed in a mirror. A voice heard in the hills. A man who planted barley by moonlight and never returned. Other times, they were so long they stretched across nights. Picked up again like dropped threads. Where were we? Someone would ask, days later, and the answer would come, immediate and certain: he had just entered the cave. He had just heard the voice. These stories were their inheritance. More than the land, which could be seized. More than the animals, which could starve. More than the cottage, which could collapse. Language could not be taken, only forgotten. And so they remembered. Every night, around the fire, they remembered. There would come a day when the boy would grow, and the father would fade. When the girl would cradle a child of her own, and stir her own pot of gruel. And still, she would tell the story of the black stag, and the man who wandered too far, and the cold that whispered names in the wind. And when she did, her children would lean forward. Their stomachs might be empty. Their feet might be cold. But their minds would be fed. Because stories, in this place, were more than words. They were bread. And every night, before the fire died and the breath misted in the rafters and the frost crept in again, they broke that bread together, carefully, reverently, completely. Not for pleasure. For survival. The bowl was wooden, rough at the edges, carved by hand long before the child holding it had learned to speak. The spoon too, its handle smoothed by fingers long vanished, stained dark from 100,000 meals of the same few things. It wasn't a thing of beauty. It didn't need to be. What mattered was that it held something warm. Or, warm enough. It was porridge again. It was always porridge. But calling it that felt generous. Oats thinned to a watery mush, barely salted, sometimes bulked with a spoonful of barley flour if the sack hadn't run empty. If you were lucky, there might be a scrap of dried kale stirred in, boiled until limp as old cloth. Or a chunk of turnip, carved from the root cellar like a treasure. But often, it was just oats. A ghost of grain. A reminder of what food could be, stretched as thin as breath. The bowl steamed in the cold air. It was the only thing in the house that did. Breath clouded. Fingers stiffened. But the porridge gave off a faint mist that felt, just for a moment, like something sacred. They all sat on the floor. Chairs were for lords. Tables were for those with more food than floor space. Here, the family huddled close, backs to the wall, knees drawn in, bowls cradled like fragile miracles. They did not speak much during meals. Talking took energy, and every drop of it was needed for chewing, for digesting, for pretending you were full. The baby was fed first. Always. The spoon dipped into the thin gruel and touched her lips, her gums. Her mouth opened before the spoon arrived. Her instinct stronger than her doubt. The older children followed. The mother portioned carefully, eyes flicking between the bowls like a priest at a ceremony. The goal wasn't satisfaction. It was fairness. Equal emptiness for all. The father ate last. His bowl was often the least full. He never complained. That was his role, to protect the others, to take what was left, and to pretend it was enough. Sometimes he would hum while he ate, as if the tune could fill the spaces the food could not. Other times he would stare into the bowl like it held the answers to something deeper than hunger. Because hunger, in truth, was the shape of life. It wasn't an emergency, not anymore. It had become the background rhythm, like wind against the walls or the creak of wood settling in frost. It was a presence. A ghost you lived with. You didn't fight it. You folded your life around it. There was no pantry. There were no choices. There was only what the land gave and what could be preserved, and what could be stretched beyond what was reasonable. Every meal was a prayer. Not always spoken, but always felt. A prayer that this would last until the next planting. A prayer that the pig wouldn't die. That the cow would calf. That the winter wouldn't freeze the root cellar through. That the oats wouldn't mold. That no mouth would open in sickness and take more than its share. Once a month, maybe, there would be a scrap of salted meat, more fat than flesh, but enough to flavor a pot. The mother would shave off slices with the reverence of a scribe copying scripture, letting the grease melt into the porridge. That was a feast. That was a night to remember. But most days, it was the bowl. The spoon. The silence. Sometimes, the children would ask why they couldn't have what the priest had. The warm pies and the golden bread he sometimes carried from the manse, wafting smells that filled the whole lane. Or the venison the Lord's men cooked over open fires after a hunt. The parents never answered directly. They couldn't. Instead, they said what was true in a quieter way. "This is our food," the mother would say. "It's simple, and it's clean, and it comes from our hands." There was pride in that. A bitter pride, yes, but real. They had grown this. Ground it. Stored it. Stirred it while it boiled over the hearth, as smoke stung their eyes and their arms grew tired. This food had history in it. It had memory. It tasted like the soil it came from. It smelled like the wool they wore. It stuck to the ribs not because it was heavy, but because it clung like duty. And it was eaten with the same spoon every time. That mattered. That sameness. It created a rhythm, like the turning of the seasons or the ringing of the church bell. You always knew what dinner would be. And in that knowing, there was stability, if not joy. Still, when the wind howled outside, and the roof groaned beneath its weight, and the hunger carved slow tunnels through the belly, sometimes a child would close their eyes and pretend. They would imagine a crusty loaf, warm from an oven. They would imagine a wheel of cheese, soft and yellow and endless. They would imagine honey. Apples. Warm milk. Sweet things that felt like dreams. But they never asked for them aloud. That was the rule. You could imagine anything, but you couldn't ask for what couldn't come. So instead, they whispered their prayers. Thank you for the oats. Thank you for the fire. Thank you that no one is sick. Thank you that the bowl is not yet empty. Even when it was. After dinner, the bowls were wiped clean with fingers, then with rags. There was no waste. The dog licked what it could. The spoon was set back near the fire, its handle dry and warm and waiting. And then they slept. With hunger curled inside them, like a second self. A quiet reminder. A presence not to be feared, but to be respected. Because in this world, food was not flavor. It was fuel. It was a reason to keep going. It was love in physical form, prepared, shared, and gone too soon. And so the bowl, the spoon, and the prayer remained. Tomorrow, the same meal. The same silence. The same ache. But also, maybe, the same survival. At the center of the croft was not a throne, nor a statue, nor a cross. It was the hearth. Rough stones, darkened by smoke and years, ringed the small hollow where the fire lived. If it could be called a fire. Most nights, it was aglow. A stubborn, smoldering breath of heat beneath ash. But it lived, just barely. And that was enough. The hearth was never truly silent. When the wind howled against the walls and the thatch trembled overhead, the hearth answered with whispers of its own. Little crackles. Slow sighs. A hiss when damp wood gave up its ghost. It spoke in the old language, older than Gaelic, older than any lord's decree. A tongue of flame and ember, understood not with the ears, but with the skin and the soul. The children learned to listen to it. They knew the difference between a happy crackle and a dangerous snap. They knew the soft collapse of a log meant warmth for a little while longer. They knew the silence of dying coals and what it asked, more fuel. More breath. More care. The hearth had to be fed like a creature. You couldn't let it sleep too deeply. You stirred it with sticks. Blew softly when it faded. Arranged turf or peat in quiet stacks to catch and hold. You fed it dried moss when you had nothing better. You even whispered to it, sometimes. Called it, Bold One, or Warm Belly, or just, Stay with us. It was the only thing in the house that gave without taking. It gave light. Not enough to read by, but enough to see the shapes of those you loved. The flicker of a face, the glint in a tired eye, the curve of a sleeping form under wool. It gave heat. Not warmth, not truly. But it fought back the frost. Kept the teeth from chattering. Kept the water in the pail from turning to stone. Kept death at bay, in the smallest way. And it gave comfort. Not safety. But the illusion of it. Which was sometimes all you needed. The hearth was also a storyteller. Before sleep, the father would sit nearest it, hands outstretched toward the glow. He'd tell tales not in the loud voice of a bard, but in the low rhythm of a man who had seen too many winters to need exaggeration. He'd speak of wolves, real and not. Of women who walked in snow without leaving tracks. Of ancient kings whose swords turned to fire when they were angry. Of old gods who still watched from the storm clouds and from behind the stars. The flames would dance in response, casting shadows that became part of the tale. A sudden flare when the ghost arrived. A pop when the sword was struck. A breath of smoke when the curse was broken. The children leaned in. Not because they believed, but because the hearth made it all feel real. Not because the stories were true, but because the hearth made the night less empty. Sometimes, no one spoke. They simply sat, listening to the fire breathe. The mother would sew or mend, the thin needle glinting in the light. The father might sharpen a blade or carve a handle. The children watched, or dozed, or played with bits of straw and wood. There was no noise but the fire. It filled the space with its small song, ancient in content. And even in silence, the hearth held them. When someone was sick, they were moved closest to it. When a baby was born, its first cries echoed against the hearthstones. When someone died, they were washed and laid in its warmth one final time, before the cold claimed them completely. The hearth was the first and last witness to every life lived in that place. It wasn't grand. It didn't blaze like the fireplaces in the castles of the nobility. It didn't have carved mantles or iron grates. It was soot and ash and stone and survival. It was ugly. But it never judged. It never turned anyone away. Even when the fuel ran low and the flames sank down to coals, it offered what it could. You could sit by it and feel the ache ease from your fingers. The sting leave your toes. The fear settle in your chest. Not disappear, just soften. Like the light softening the faces around you. Like the glow softening the dark. Sometimes, the wind would try to sneak in. It would push at the thatch. Slide cold fingers through the cracks in the wall. Try to kill the fire with its breath. But the hearth had lived too long to be so easily ended. A few embers always remained. In the early morning, the mother would rise first. She would kneel before the stones, her breath misting in the pale air, and she would coax those embers back to life. She would feed them twigs and scraps. She would cup her hands around them, whispering the old words. And slowly, the glow would return. Not a fire. Not yet. But a promise. A beginning. A resistance against the night. And as it grew, it lit the faces of the sleeping family, one by one. They would rise. They would eat. They would work. They would shiver and mend and worry. But always, they would return to the hearth. Because no matter what else the day took from them, the crops, the strength, the hope, the hearth remained. A little warmth. A little light. A little voice, in a language older than pain, saying quietly, "You're still here. You're still warm. For now." And that was everything. The wind had calmed, but inside the village, there was still a certain tightness to the air. You could hear it in the crack of wood being split, the sharp clack of hooves on packed dirt, the low murmur of voices wary of being overheard. Here in the folds of the Scottish Highlands, justice did not wear robes or sit in great stone halls. It wore wool cloaks, leather boots, and the weight of memory. In the croft, justice was personal. Disputes were not sealed with signatures but with calloused hands and heavy glances. A stolen sheep, a broken fence, a whispered insult, any of these could light the kindling of retribution. And retribution, when it came, did not always knock at the door. Sometimes it left a dead rooster on your stoop. Other times, a dagger planted in your fields. It was not always like this. Or perhaps it was, but softer, older, wrapped in rites that once had names but were now only gestures, a stone turned a certain way, a prayer murmured in Gaelic over a boundary line. The old laws, Brehon, clan decrees, the wisdom of the fireside, still lived, even if the crown and church had tried to snuff them out. You could feel them in the way elders fell silent when a stranger passed. In the way children were told never to speak of certain hills after dark. Justice, to the peasant, was not about law. It was about balance. When a man took more than his share of the peat, the moss remembered. When a family hoarded barley through winter, there were always eyes watching. Not official eyes. Not robed monks or royal envoys. But eyes that mattered more, neighbors, kin, ghosts of kin. Eyes that had watched the birth of children, the death of cattle, the starving of whole years. The church had its way. It rang its bells, held its confessionals, offered a sacrament for the absolution of sins. But some sins couldn't be absolved by bread and wine. Some had to be answered with silence, exile, or in the worst of times, with blood. There was a story told in hushed tones when the fire burned low. Of a man who betrayed his brother's land for a sack of silver from a southern noble. When the fields were stripped and the family fled, the traitor returned to his croft with coin and cattle. But in the spring thaw, his cattle wandered in circles, his hearth would not hold fire, and his sleep was torn by screams that had no source. They said he woke one morning with his tongue black and cold as stone. No one buried him. He was left for the crows. This was justice. It was not always cruel. Sometimes it was a quiet mercy, a loaf left on a widow's step, a fence mended in the night for a crippled man. These two were acts of balance. A redress of the invisible scales that held the fragile peace of a people too poor to waste their anger, but too proud to swallow dishonor. The dagger and the blessing were never far apart. There was the healer woman, known more for her herbs than her prayers. When a boy was found with his face blue from a berry he should not have eaten, it was she who crushed the antidote. And yet when the priest's dog died after sniffing her satchel, the churchman called her a witch. Some wanted her drowned. Others, burnt. But on the morning of her trial, the village square was empty. No one spoke for her. But no one raised the torch, either. The wind howled for 3 days, and when it ceased, she was still there, sitting on the stump outside her hut, stirring broth for the sick. Sometimes, not choosing was the closest thing to justice anyone could manage. And then there were the elders. Old men with mouths like crumpled parchment and eyes like winter sky. They remembered times when the king's name was never spoken, when the law was a song sung before a duel. They sat in corners of crofts, half asleep, but listening always. Their presence at a meal, their nod at a birth, their silence at a wedding, all these were judgments, as binding as any decree from Edinburgh. Children learned early to read those signs. A child who misbehaved was not punished outright. Instead, a wooden spoon might vanish. The better portion of stew might pass them by. A story told at night would contain a character with their exact name, who met a dark fate for deeds that mirrored their own. This too was justice. In a world where lords took what they pleased, and the church spoke in Latin no one understood, justice had to come from within. From the look in a mother's eyes. From the grip of a friend's hand. From the quiet warning in the way your name was said at dusk. So when we speak of brutality in medieval Scotland, do not think only of axes and gallows. Think of the silence that fell when someone entered a room unwelcomed. Think of the path untrodden because of who lived at its end. Think of the dagger and the blessing, carried in the same cloak pocket, used with equal precision. Because in the crofts, justice was not a system. It was a memory. And everyone remembered. Even the wind. Even the stone. There was no judge in a red robe. No sealed verdict. No gavels or clean legalese. In the cragged glens of medieval Scotland, justice wore no face and followed no map. It drifted instead like smoke, carried in the stories that lingered in hearth ashes and whispered through fields of heather long after blood had soaked into the earth. Blood feud wasn't just a word. It was a slow fire. Sometimes passed down like a hearthstone. Sometimes lit by a single insult, one word at the wrong gathering, one blade drawn too fast. But once it began, it rarely died in the season it was born. In the Highlands, kin mattered more than law. Your people were your shelter. Your safety. Your identity. So if someone harmed your kin, even slightly, it wasn't just a personal matter. It was communal. It echoed. A cousin insulted in trade might mean tension at every future wedding. A brother injured in a skirmish might mean a year without safe travel. An uncle slain might mean generations bound to a quiet pact of watchfulness and wariness. Not every grudge turned to bloodshed, but every grudge waited. Patient, often invisible. Like a snowdrift pressed hard against a door, felt but not seen. And the strange part? This wasn't always fueled by rage. Sometimes it was duty. Quiet, heavy, inherited. You might not even have known the name of the man your grandfather once fought. But you'd been told, without being told, not to step foot in that glen, not to barter in that village. Old ghosts, still drawing borders. Sometimes, blood feuds came from cattle. A theft blamed on the wrong clan. A pasture trespass with no witness but the sky. Other times, it came from marriage. One family refused a union. Or worse, accepted it, only to betray it later. In a land so intimately tied to name, land, and family, love could quickly turn political, and politics could curdle into lifelong distrust. But what does that look like in the daily cold? It looks like eyes never meeting at market. Like neighbors planting rows that never touch. It's the pause before opening a door. The silence around a shared well. Children told never to play beyond a certain stone wall, not because of wolves, but because of memory. The land remembered. And people listened. And yet, peace was always possible. Woven, slowly, in threads of gesture. A feast shared after years of tension. A marriage arranged to unite rather than divide. A priest interceding between two families who refused to share communion wine. In the rare moments where forgiveness bloomed, it felt like a change in the weather. Sharp. Sudden. Nearly sacred. Still, the grudge had its rituals. Some families carved secret notches into beams, reminders of offense, of oath, of unspoken debts. Others sang lullabies filled with warnings that had no names but carried weight. Some wore tokens from the dead, rings, cloth scraps, fragments of iron, symbols of both memory and motivation. You might think such a life sounds grim, even poisoned. But remember, the people who lived this also laughed, sang, and raised children beneath that heavy sky. The feud, like winter, was simply a condition of life. Sometimes it blanketed everything. Sometimes it melted away. But it was never entirely gone. A man might kneel in a kirk on Sunday and plot quiet vengeance on Monday. A woman might mend a stranger's wound in silence, never revealing that stranger once belonged to a name her father had cursed. Mercy existed, but it was cautious. Earned. Like trust between wolves. And always, there were the watchers. The elders who remembered too much. Who had seen too many fires at too many funerals. They spoke rarely. And when they did, it was slow. Their stories were not just entertainment, they were the ledger. They knew who owed who had forgiven, who had not. Sometimes, the feud ended in blood. A sudden storm of steel and red. A reaping done under cloak of night. But more often, it faded with age. A grudge that outlived its purpose. Grandchildren asking why they couldn't visit the other side of the river, and parents unable to explain. That is how grudges die, not with apologies, but with forgetting. Still, some families never forgot. And their names still hum in the stones. The lesson of these feuds was not just caution. It was memory. Memory worn heavy like a wool cloak, soaked in rain and smoke. And for many, it was a form of belonging. To hold a grudge meant to hold a place, to be anchored in the woven tangle of the village's long and haunted past. And yet, underneath it all, a hope, that the blade would stay sheathed. That the fire would stay in the hearth, not leap to the roof. That one generation might decide, quietly, to put down the weight. Because even in the darkest feud, the snow still fell. The oatcake still cooked on the griddle. Children still needed lullabies. And sometimes, a man who had sworn vengeance found himself watching his enemy's widow struggle with frostbite, and brought firewood anyway. In that moment, the grudge did not vanish. But it blinked. The monastery sat like a shadow against the snow-covered hill, its stones older than any living man, its silence older still. Even the wind seemed to hush as it passed the high walls, whether out of reverence or suspicion, no one could say. And within that cloistered chill, the monks moved not like men, but like the passing of time itself, slow, unhurried, deliberate. They did not speak unless spoken to. And even then, words were weighed like coins, spent carefully, as if language itself might run out. Their world was quiet, parchment, candle, bread, prayer. But outside the monastery's thick walls, the world of peasants howled like wolves through the valley. And the monks saw it all. Not in the way a traveler might see a village. No, they saw it in slivers, in supplications, in silence. They saw it in the calloused hands that knocked on their gate with trembling urgency. In the young men who entered the cloister not out of faith, but out of famine. In the confessions whispered through lattice screens, sins soaked in hunger, in rage, in desperation. A monk did not flinch at the mention of theft. Not here. Not in winter. To steal bread in December was not wickedness, it was simply breathing with one more day's hope. Still, forgiveness was offered. Softly. Patiently. And never with judgment, only prayer. Behind those thick stone walls, winter had a different face. There was warmth, however meager. Meals, however plain. Beds, however narrow. And above all, structure. Ritual. Predictability. In a world where peasants lived at the mercy of frost and feudal lords, the monastery felt like a clock that could not break. But it came at a price. The monk shed his name when he entered. His past. His family. The ache in his belly might disappear, but a new emptiness often replaced it. The kind that no porridge could soothe. A silence too loud to sleep through. A penance too long to finish. He copied texts by candlelight, letters in Latin he didn't always understand. He rose before dawn to chant psalms to a sky still ink-black. He dug graves for brothers whose silence had finally become permanent. And through it all, he watched. He watched the villagers struggle up the hill in worn boots, desperate for a cure from Brother Aiden's herb garden. He watched fathers barter chickens for a prayer. He watched the snow fall on graves dug too shallow, watched children kneel at the edge of Mass with hands trembling not from reverence, but from cold. The monks knew much. They were scholars, some of them. Scribes. Keepers of texts written when Rome still called the shots. But knowledge was not power here, it was preservation. The outside world burned through seasons like fire through peat. The monastery endured. That was its power. And still, they did not interfere. Not openly. They did not denounce the Lord who demanded too much grain in a season of blight. They did not warn the young bride about her husband's drunken fists. They did not chase off the soldiers when they took more than just livestock from the village girls. They said, "Pray." They said, "It is not for us to judge." They said, "The Lord sees all." But they saw it, too. Not every monk was silent in the same way. Some offered what they could, an extra bowl of broth to the widowed mother, an herb bundle slipped into a frostbitten hand, a whispered warning to the young shepherd boy not to go near the castle on feast day. And sometimes, in the deepest part of night, they wrote. Not just psalms. Not just letters. But truths. Hidden in the margins. A name scratched in the corner of a hymn. A date circled in red. A drawing, faint as smoke, of a face never to be forgotten. The monastery's walls did not echo with screams. But the silence they held, that told stories of its own. The cold within the monastery was not like the cold outside. Outside, it bit. It stung. It threatened death. Inside, it crept. It numbed. It sat in the joints, in the mind. And so, many monks wrapped their souls in routine as tightly as they wrapped their cloaks. Because routine gave shape to what winter tried to erase. But every brother remembered where he came from. Every monk had once been a son. A farmer. A younger sibling. A shepherd. Their faces might have grown gaunt with ascetic life, their backs bowed with years of kneeling, but their eyes still flickered with memory. Some found peace in their chants. Others only distraction. And when spring came, if it came, it did not erase what winter revealed. They still prayed for the girl who miscarried on the monastery steps. For the man who was buried in a borrowed shroud. For the family who left behind no name, only the scorched remains of their hut near the woods. They prayed. But not always out of hope. Sometimes, it was habit. Sometimes, it was guilt. Sometimes, it was the only way they could carry the things they'd seen without going mad. Outside, the peasants saw the monks as distant. Holy, perhaps. Strange, surely. But safe. The monastery was a fixed star in their unpredictable sky. And perhaps that was enough. A place that held the records. A place that endured. Even if the monks inside whispered prayers they no longer believed. Even if they wrote truths they'd never speak aloud. Even if their silence wasn't virtue, but survival. In that cloistered chill, the world narrowed to what could be endured. To what could be hidden. And sometimes, to what could not be forgiven, but had to be forgotten anyway. The monks saw it all. And they said nothing. The road was not a road, not in the way roads are drawn on maps. It was a line of pressed snow between two long-breathing fields, barely a track, barely a path. If you didn't know where it led, you'd think it led nowhere. But the pilgrim walked it anyway, hood pulled low, shoulders hunched against the biting sky, boots whispering frost-crackled prayers with every step. He had begun days ago, though days were harder to measure in winter. The sun never rose fully, only limped along the edges of the horizon. And night came not like a curtain, but a soaking, slow and deep, until even memory went dim. His name had once been spoken with weight and love. Now it was just another thing he didn't carry. On his back, a thin sack. On his chest, nothing but regret and wool. He walked not for food, nor fame, nor destination. He walked for forgiveness. A sin, he would not name aloud. A burden, too old to lift but too fresh to ignore. The village priest had said, pilgrimage, then. Walk until your feet bleed, and perhaps your soul will soften. The monk's voice had been like the chapel's wooden pew, splintered, heavy, but unmoving. So the pilgrim walked. And winter watched. The wind did not howl today. It sighed. The kind of sigh a parent makes when watching a child repeat a mistake they once made themselves. Trees lined the horizon like forgotten sentinels, their bark etched with the same patience the pilgrim now clung to. No birds called. Even the crows had gone quiet. On the third day, if it was the third, the frost came deeper. It crawled past the boots, past the soles, and kissed the bones of his toes. His hands had lost the ability to feel whether he gripped his walking stick or not. But he gripped it still, not from strength, but from routine. He passed no one. He saw no light but his breath in the air and the occasional flicker of sun like a blade behind the clouds. When he found a stone to sit on, he didn't rest, not truly. He simply stopped moving, and listened to the silence as if it might confess something. Villagers whispered stories of pilgrims who died mid-step, eyes open, mouths caught in a final prayer. But the pilgrim didn't fear that. He feared what waited if he ever turned back. He feared the weight returning would bring. Out here, the cold was honest. It stripped everything down, ego, memory, comfort, and left only what was real. Frost and footsteps. Sometimes, as he walked, he whispered names. Not loudly. Just softly enough that the wind could take them before he did. The name of a brother. A wife. A child. Or all three. He never said what he had done. Only what he remembered. Forgiveness wasn't a coin he expected to be handed. He didn't know what he would find at the end of the path. Maybe a shrine. Maybe a ruined chapel. Maybe nothing. But the walking was the point. Not arrival. The cold was the penance. At a frozen stream, he knelt to drink. The ice cracked beneath his knees, a warning. He cupped his hands and brought the chill to his lips. It tasted like stone and memory. Behind him, his footprint stretched like an unraveling thread, so fragile that one gust could erase it all. Once, he came upon a burned-out cottage, roof caved, hearth blackened, door leaning like a drunk. He did not enter. He stood outside, touching the edge of its ruin as if asking permission. Then he bowed slightly, as if to the ghosts within, and walked on. That night, he slept beneath a twisted tree, its branches like pleading arms reaching skyward. The stars were so distant, they may as well have been regrets. He huddled into his cloak, bones aching, stomach echoing its emptiness. Still, he dreamed. Of warmer years. Of voices calling him to come inside. Of firelight that didn't flicker from memory. When he awoke, his eyelashes were crusted in ice. His breath came slow. But he stood. Somewhere, far ahead, weeks or days or hours, stood a chapel carved into the face of a cliff. He had heard stories. That those who reached it sometimes wept without knowing why. That its altar was not gold, but stone. That no monk lived there, only the wind and the weight of repentance. He wasn't sure he believed in miracles. But he believed in walking. In frost. In listening to silence until it began to speak back. His feet blistered inside his boots. His knees cracked like old wood. His fingers tingled, then went numb, then pulsed back to pain again. He didn't curse the cold. It reminded him he was still carrying something. Still penitent. Once, as dusk fell like a heavy curtain, he came upon another figure, older, wrapped in furs, sitting beside a small fire near a frozen stump. They said nothing. Only nodded to each other. The pilgrim sat across the flame, held out his hands, and for a moment, felt the memory of warmth. Not heat. But closeness. The other man shared no name. Neither did he. But they were the same in that hour, men who had walked too far to be afraid anymore. In the morning, the fire was ash. The other man was gone. But something stayed. A kind of silence that didn't feel empty. Eventually, when the trees thinned and the rocks sharpened, he saw it, the edge of a stone structure jutting from the cliff face like a wound. The chapel. Or its memory. Or some trick of frost and hope. His breath caught, not from awe, but from something simpler. Something like release. He didn't rush. He took each step like a prayer. And when he reached the chapel, he did not knock. He sat. Back against the stone. Eyes closed. He didn't speak. Not all forgiveness is spoken. Some is walked. Some is breathed. Some is earned step by frozen step, in silence, when no one is watching. And the frost, which had followed him so long, sat beside him, not as punishment, but as witness. There were no lanterns on the road. Just the long gray hush of a winter afternoon, falling into a darker, colder stillness. The path that cut between the hills looked like a wound sealed in frost, white, silent, and waiting. And beyond that path, in the hollows where the snow lay deepest, danger had teeth. The people in the glen did not speak of wolves during the harvest months. But when the frost clung to the windows, and the smoke from the hearths curled tighter around the roofs, they began to whisper. Not from fear, but from respect. The kind of respect one gives the sea or the plague, ancient things that could arrive without knocking. The wolf was never just a wolf. It was the dark shape you saw at the edge of your torchlight. The echo you heard on the far side of the moor. The cold that bit harder when you walked alone. For the peasants of medieval Scotland, winter wasn't simply hard. It was a siege. Cold, hunger, silence, and the wolf. Hunger with a face. The beast outside the croft wall, pacing in the dark, waiting for the scent of weakness. Children were taught the sound of the forest falling still. When the birds stopped singing, the old ones said, "Listen for breathing that isn't your own." Crofters nailed carved charms to their lintels, small discs of wood etched with runes or bits of bone bound in twine. Not to ward off evil spirits, but to remind themselves, "We see you. We know you're there." Sometimes, at night, a flock would panic, sheep bleating, a dog growling low, the whole farmyard waking like a heartbeat skipped. And in the snow come morning, paw prints the size of open palms would lead back into the woods. The wolves knew when people were weak. They waited for famine to soften the bones of the glen, for the men to walk farther from home in search of firewood or rabbits. They watched. They learned. They remembered which paths people used and which feet limped. To walk the road alone in January was to carry your own eulogy in your boots. But people did it. Because the next village had barley. Because a neighbor had lost a child and needed prayers. Because sometimes, the church bell would call, and you answered even if the wind carried teeth. It was said that wolves hunted in silence when they meant it. That you wouldn't hear them until it was too late. But others claimed the opposite, that they wanted you to know they were coming. That they wanted your panic to quicken the blood. That they enjoyed the rhythm of fear. Old tales told of wolf spirits, familiars of witches, or the souls of cursed men who died angry. There were those who believed that wolves could speak, though few claimed to have heard them. In truth, most villagers never saw the wolves at all. But the fear of them carved itself into every action. A mother would clutch her child tighter near dusk. A man would choose to walk the longer path that hugged the frozen stream, avoiding the tree lean where eyes might glint. The fear lived longer than the footprints. Some winters, there were stories, of men found torn in the hills, of travelers who never returned. These were told low, near the hearth, with eyes that didn't blink too often. But always, the last line was the same: he should not have walked alone. The wolf was not the only predator. But it was the most honest. It did not pretend to be anything else. It wanted warmth. Blood. Bone. The same things the people did, though they pretended to want less. Somewhere in that brutal honesty was a terrible kinship. The crofters, too, had a hunger they could not tame. And so, on a night much like the others, a boy of 12 stood watch while his father mended the fence. The moon above was the color of old milk, and the trees moved like breath held too long. The boy saw it first, a shadow not quite moving, a shape too deliberate to be wind. His fingers tightened around a horn slung at his waist. He did not blow it. Instead, he held still. So did the wolf. They watched each other. Two creatures of the same winter, two beings made small by the size of the cold. The boy's breath misted the air between them. The wolf's eyes caught the moon and gave it back. And then it left. Not because it was afraid. But because it was not yet the right time. The boy never told anyone. Not because he was ashamed. But because something in him understood. The wolf, like the winter, was not the villain of the tale. It was the shape of the season. The reminder that survival was never guaranteed. That danger had always been part of the world, long before kings drew borders or priests built stone altars. The road that led through the hills would always carry the risk. But the people walked it still. With charms in their pockets. With prayers on their tongues. And with eyes that watched the edge of the woods, listening not just for the howl, but for the quiet that came before it. Because the wolf was not just a beast of the forest. It was part of the story. And like all stories in the cold, it waited to be remembered. There were 2 knocks at the door, never 3. 3 was the priest. 1 was a neighbor. But 2. 2 meant the healer had come. In the frozen breath of a highland winter, illness crept like smoke beneath the doors. It began small, a cough that lingered, a child's warmth that didn't return with the morning sun. The people of the croft knew what followed. The ache behind the eyes. The shaking that the fire couldn't stop. The sweat that smelled of something ancient, something sour, like the grave had already reached up to press its lips to your skin. They didn't have names for all the sicknesses. No Latin, no diagnosis. Just signs. Just knowing. The breath that whistled instead of flowed. The skin that turned the color of old milk or faded parchment. The silence in a child who used to babble. A mother who stopped humming. And when it became too much, when prayer and poultice and warmth from the hearth gave no answer, someone would walk, even in the frost, even at night, to find her. The healer. She didn't live in the village, not exactly. Her home was where the land began to change, near the peat cuttings and beyond the gnarled trees, where the stones grew mossy and the birds fell silent. They said she knew the woods in ways even the animals didn't. That she could find a sprig of green beneath 6 inches of snow. That she could hear the sound of a fever from a mile away. She had no title. No apprenticeship. Just time, and memory, and the tools passed down to her like sacred fire. A mortar smooth with use. A wooden spoon blackened by the same pot used through 4 generations. And a pouch, always a pouch, filled with scraps of dried plant, twisted roots, bark, bone, and tiny bottles that clinked softly like distant bells. When she knocked, people listened. And when she entered, they watched. Not with fear, exactly. But with that quiet reverence reserved for the things that did not belong entirely to this world. She always smelled of peat smoke and pine. Her hands were dry, her fingernails dark from herbs and ash. But her eyes were clear. Not cruel, not warm, just clear. Like she saw past the flesh and into the thread that tied someone to this world. And sometimes, she knew when that thread was fraying. She did not promise healing. Only help. She would crouch beside the sick, listening not just to the cough or the breathing, but to the room. The rhythm of fear. The story in the silence. Then she'd pull something from her pouch, say nothing for a long while, and begin. Sometimes it was a steam, herbs boiling in water, the sick breathing in the scented mist while everyone else held their breath. Sometimes it was a paste, smeared across the chest or the soles of the feet, bound with cloth and hope. Other times, it was simple, warmth, touch, whispers. She knew when the body had a chance and when it didn't. And when it didn't, she stayed anyway. There was dignity in the work of her hands, in the way she tidied a dying person's hair, placed a warm cloth on their brow, muttered words that weren't prayers but sounded like them. When the priest couldn't come, and he often couldn't, not in storm or plague, she was the one who helped someone leave this life with their eyes closed gently and their hands clean. Afterward, she'd sit quietly near the hearth, warming her palms, eyes low. The family would try to offer food, broth, oatcakes, maybe a cracked egg. Sometimes, even a coin. She rarely accepted, but always touched the offered item with her fingers, as if blessing it or memorizing the gratitude inside it. Then, without fanfare, she'd stand. Repack her pouch. And disappear into the cold again. But for days afterward, her scent would linger in the croft, the scent of damp wool, wood smoke, and something sharp like juniper. And so would the feeling that, for a moment, someone ancient and careful had watched over your home. Some feared her, though they would never say it aloud. She knows too much, they whispered. She walks with spirits. But those same people would send for her when the fever came. Because in the quiet, after the fires dimmed and the cold pressed through the shutters, what they wanted was not a miracle, but a witness. Someone to see the struggle. Someone to remind the winter that not all life slipped away unseen. She knew the old remedies, foxglove to slow the heart, willow bark for pain, fennel for digestion, mugwort for dreams. She brewed tonics that were both medicine and memory. She sang, sometimes, in the old tongue. Songs with no known words, but patterns passed from mouth to ear, meant to soothe the body and quiet the soul. When spring came, if it came, people would talk about her less. She was a winter presence, like the frost, the wolf, the silence. But they always remembered. When someone survived after a long illness, it was said, the healer came. And when they didn't, at least she came. Because her presence meant that someone still cared enough to knock twice. That illness, even if it won, did not do so alone. She had no stone carved in her honor. No lineage recorded in the Kirk books. But her name lived in the hush between verses. In the cracked walls of crofts where she had once knelt. In the bundles of herbs still hung above hearths, long dried and dusty, but never removed. And in the hearts of those who had once, in their most fragile moment, heard that soft double knock on the door. Not the priest. Not the neighbor. But the one who came in silence and left without goodbye. There was no fire in the chapel. No hearth, no coals, no kettle steaming in the corner. The warmth, if there was any to be found, came only from breath, 50 or more in one room, shoulders tight, wool cloaks pulled close, boots damp and steaming from the frost outside. Even the candles gave off more light than heat. Thin wax spines that flickered with draughts that whispered across the stone floor. Still, they came. Every Sunday. Every holy day. Every birth and marriage and death. Because even in the cold, even in the darkest part of the Highland winter, the chapel was where salvation was spoken, and perhaps, if you were lucky, where your soul might be warmed, even if your body never was. The building was plain. Stone fitted without polish. Wood beams overhead, thick with soot from centuries of breath and smoke. No windows, only slits, cut narrow, that let in grey morning and let out nothing. The wind sometimes whistled through them, and people would say it was the angels singing, though they sounded more like ghosts. Benches lined the room, rough, backless things. Those who couldn't sit stood. And those who couldn't stand knelt, not in softness, but on cracked flagstones that remembered every winter more than they remembered any sermon. The priest wore wool like the rest of them. His collar was a strip of linen bleached and blessed. His fingers, when they lifted the bread and the chalice, were red with cold and swollen with age. But his voice carried. Not always with warmth. But always with weight. He spoke Latin, most couldn't understand it. But the rhythm was familiar, like a lullaby whose words you never knew, but always felt. Then came the Gaelic, the prayers translated. Slow, steady, thick with pause. Not rushed. Never rushed. Because in that cold, nothing moved fast. Even the heart, under enough wool and fear and hope, beat a little slower. The church was not a place of spectacle. There were no stained glass windows, no gold leaf, no marble. Only a wooden cross. A bell that rang with a tired echo. And a carved basin of water so cold that even dipping your fingers into it made you clench your jaw. But the people believed. Not because of what they saw, but because of what they'd been told. And because when the world gave you frostbite, famine, sickness, and silence, the promise of something after this life, something better, was as vital as bread. Sometimes more so. There were stories passed among the villagers, not from the pulpit, but whispered at night, that said the church was a threshold. That prayers spoken aloud in the chapel hung in the rafters like smoke, waiting for the saints to gather them up. That the breath you gave in worship came back to you as favor. Or mercy. Or maybe just one more day. No one questioned that faith and cold walked hand in hand. To kneel on ice-covered stone. To bow your head when the wind slid through the doorway. To say, Amen, with chapped lips and a shivering spine, that was as much a part of belief as scripture. The children fidgeted, but even they knew to keep still. There was no reward for noise. No tolerance for disruption. Only a stern glance from a mother, or a cuff from a father, and the reminder that this quiet, this chapel, this ritual, was the only thing holding back the void. Sometimes, the priest spoke of hell. Not fire, but absence. A place colder than the chapel, colder than the grave. Where light never reached and warmth was forgotten. And in those moments, everyone in that stone room looked to the altar not just for grace, but for insulation, from sin, from the cold, from the endlessness of suffering. Confession was offered in whispers, behind a wooden screen, or beside the chapel's outer wall. People confessed more in winter than in summer. As if the cold peeled back pride. As if mortality crept closer when the sun failed to rise before morning chores, and darkness arrived before supper. Baptisms were fast. Infants were dunked or touched with water barely above freezing. Mothers wept not from joy but from fear, the fear of sickness, of the child catching a chill too deep to chase out. Funerals were quiet. The dead laid on stone slabs while prayers rose like steam. The priest's words did not promise heaven, not outright. Only hope. Only the chance that the next world would not bite the skin or hollow the bones. And for many, that was enough. In the dark of winter, in the chapel without fire, people held their faith like a cloak, thin in places, patched with doubt, but better than nothing. They prayed not to live forever, but simply to see spring. To bury their dead with dignity. To feel, if only once more, the sun on their face and believe it meant something. The church did not save everyone. But it gave shape to the struggle. It gave voice to the silence. It gave names, saint, sinner, penitent, redeemed, to those who otherwise would have only been cold and forgotten. And that alone made people return. Week after week. Year after year. To the stone building. To the bitter air. To the slow chant and the breathless amen. Because even in the heart of winter, even when the frost claimed the fields and the hearths barely glowed, a chapel with no fire could still hold warmth. If not in flame, then in faith. If not in comfort, then in communion. If not in answers, then in the gathering of those who still believed that something holy waited on the other side of suffering. And maybe, just maybe, it was listening. There was no clean line between a peasant and a soldier in medieval Scotland. Only the field. And the bones that stayed behind. You might have begun your morning sowing oats with cold stiff hands, eyes squinting toward the rising mist. But by dusk, you could be holding a rusted pike, called not by choice but by need, by pressure, by the summons of a lord you never once met eye to eye. You didn't wear armor. You didn't carry banners. You were told to stand, to swing, to bleed, and you did. There were no uniforms in the frost-covered glens. Only tunics darkened by sweat and fear. Feet wrapped in scraps of leather. And a name whispered to yourself so you wouldn't forget who you were when the screaming started. Some fought for their land, not out of pride, but because it was all they had. A rented field. A pig. A thatched roof patched with more hope than straw. Others fought because they had no land at all, and the sword was the only tool that paid in coin instead of calluses. But once you crossed into the field of battle, it no longer mattered where you came from. The frost crunched the same underfoot. The wind carved through flesh and cloth without caring what name you bore. And when you fell, the earth made no distinction between plowhand and pikeman. The blood seeped into the same soil. And bones, well, they all looked the same once time had its say. In the eyes of the lords, the peasants were bodies to be counted, not names to be mourned. They were summoned with a seal, marched out with promises of heaven, and left in ditches when the prayers ran dry. Sometimes, they returned home, limping, silent, a tooth missing or an eye clouded. They brought back no medals, only nightmares. And the scars no one could see were the ones that kept them awake through the long Highland nights. Warfare wasn't glory. It was mud. It was the ache in your arms after swinging a makeshift blade against someone who looked just like you. It was cold steel in the gut. It was a brother lying face down, and the choice to keep running. Or not. And still, the battles came. The kings wanted borders. The clans wanted vengeance. The nobles wanted to prove loyalty. And the peasants, they only wanted to survive. But survival had its cost. You paid it with your back in the field. You paid it with your blood on the road. And if you were lucky, you died fast. But most didn't. They lingered. They groaned beneath carts on the way home. Or they limped into the village chapel, not for absolution, but because they had nowhere else to go. They sat near the hearths like stones that had seen too many winters. They didn't speak of what they'd done. Not really. Only hints. Only half-truths offered through clenched jaws and empty eyes. And when the snow came, and the fields lay buried beneath frost and stillness, some would walk to the edges of the old battle sites. Not to mourn. Not even to remember. But simply to stand. Because somewhere beneath their boots, bones remained. Bones of friends. Of enemies. Of those who never came home and those who did, but never quite returned. The wind carried names there. Not spoken, but felt. Carried in the hush between breath and exhale. In the crunch of ice beneath footfalls. In the echo of crows circling overhead. The lines were always blurred. One winter, you might feed your family by growing turnips. The next, you might feed them by stealing from a fallen man. And by spring, someone else would be tending your field, your name unspoken, your bones waiting for another frost to settle above them. In the songs sung around the fire, those old, slow ballads, the warriors were always noble, always brave. But the old ones, the ones with hollow eyes and shaking hands, they knew better. The songs left out the hunger. The fear. The snow falling soft as ash on the fallen. The breath caught in the chest when you heard the horn and knew you had to run, toward, not away. There were no statues for the peasant soldiers. No scrolls etched with their deeds. Only stories. And even those faded, softened by time like frost melting on morning grass. But sometimes, a child would ask their grandfather why he flinched at the sound of wood splitting. And the old man would say nothing. Only stare into the fire, where shapes moved like men in battle, silent and shadowed. The field forgot names. But the bones remembered. Every cracked rib. Every blade-kissed spine. Every frozen finger clenched around a stick sharpened to resemble a sword. The soil drank them all. And the next season, it would yield barley. Or weeds. Or more bones. But life would continue. Because the peasant and the soldier, they were the same. Both sowed. Both bled. Both served kings who never felt the wind the same way. And in the end, both returned to the earth. The only true kingdom that ever kept its promises. There was no silence in a Scottish winter croft. Even when the night held its breath. Even when the snow pressed thick against the thatched roof and the hearth barely whispered flame. There were the sounds of straw settling under bodies, of the wind kissing cracks in the walls, of breath held, not from fear, but pain. And beneath it all, one sound waited to be born, the cry of a child. In that small space, part shelter, part altar, a woman knelt, doubled forward, lips bitten white. There was no doctor. There were no potions of comfort, no iron beds or silver instruments. Only rough hands washed in cold water. Only another woman beside her, older, quiet, her face set like a cliff against the tide. They did not speak. There were no words that could soften what must happen. Only firelight danced across the walls, casting long shadows on rough stone. The warmth was shallow, flickering, barely holding off the cold that crouched just outside. And still, she labored. She, who had scrubbed floors with frozen knuckles. Who had bent to lift peat with a belly grown heavy. Who had nursed the living while grieving the dead. Now she was alone, not in body, but in burden. Childbirth was not rare. It was not dramatic. It was not celebrated, not really. It was just another winter task. Like chopping wood. Like boiling roots into broth. A part of the cold season's rhythm. A thing that happened and sometimes did not end in joy. A bowl of water steamed near the hearth, though it had long gone lukewarm. A wool cloth lay ready, coarse and clean. A knife had been heated over flame and set aside. Not for cutting food. Not tonight. Outside, the wind moaned through the heather. Inside, the pain climbed. Built. Broke. Her breath came sharp. Then ragged. Then silent. The older woman, the midwife, moved like a tree bowing to wind. Steady. Measured. She had done this before, dozens of times. In crofts, in barns, once even in a ditch. She had seen babies born blue and quiet. Others born wailing, full of fight. She had buried some. She had named others when the mothers could not. Tonight, she watched. Listened. Waited. The fire cracked softly, a reminder that something still burned, that something still held. And then, the sound changed. Not loud. But primal. A low cry, part animal, part prayer, and then. The first wet gasp of life. A child, slick and red and curled tight against the cold world that waited for it. The midwife moved fast now, her fingers sure, not gentle but careful. She wrapped the baby in the waiting cloth, swaddled it against the cruel air, brought it close to the fire for a moment, not too near, just enough. Then silence again. No wail. Only breathing. Shallow. But steady. The mother did not speak. Could not. Her eyes were open but distant, as if she were listening to something deeper than sound, older than language. She had been to the edge. Had knelt before a door and knocked. And now she was back. The child was placed on her chest. Skin to skin. Warmth to warmth. Breath to breath. And in that moment, it did not matter that they had no meat. That the walls let in cold. That death had slept in this house before. For one breath. One heartbeat. They were alive. That was enough. The midwife sat back. Rubbed her fingers together. She would stay the night. She always did. Not because she feared complications, though they were always possible, but because birth, like death, left a room changed. And someone needed to witness what the walls had seen. The mother closed her eyes. Not to sleep. But to retreat. To drift on the edge of dreams, neither waking nor gone, where pain dissolved and only the child remained. The fire gave off one last pop, a tiny ember leaping before fading. In the stillness that followed, time stretched. Outside, snow continued to fall, silent and endless, cloaking the world in white. Inside, the new life breathed softly. And the woman who had brought it forth lay in the half-light, in a stillness carved from bone and blood and will. No songs would be sung. No feast would be held. But something sacred had happened here. Not in the eyes of the church. Not in the scrolls of the crown. But in the hush of a mother's breath. In the glow of her trembling fingers as they stroked the downy crown of her child's head. In the warmth of one human holding another. And in the knowing look the midwife cast toward the door, as if daring death to enter again. This was a woman's winter. Not marked on calendars. Not etched in stone. But held in the silent records of firelight and frost. There are losses that thunder, that bring neighbors to the threshold, that summon bells and shouts and sudden prayers. And then there are losses that arrive like the last breath of a candle. Quiet. Dim, ash-colored. Not spoken of, but never forgotten. This is the story of that kind of grief. The kind that sat in the corners of stone crofts. The kind that smelled like peat smoke and cold bread. The kind that clung to the hands of a child who no longer had a name to whisper before sleep. It was a boy. Or perhaps a girl. The stories disagree, and so do the memories of those long gone. But what remains, what matters, is that the child had small feet and eyes too large for their face. And that one day, those eyes watched someone they loved slip into stillness. It could have been a mother, curled beneath a blanket too thin for the frost. A father, whose breath gave out before the firewood did. A sister, maybe, or a brother, lost to fever, or hunger, or the sheer exhaustion of being small in a winter that asked too much. The croft did not change. The hearth still burned, even if lower. The goats still bleated. The neighbors still passed, nodding without asking. But for the child, everything bent. Tilted. Became something colder than cold. No funeral. Not really. Perhaps a wrapping of wool. Perhaps a prayer mumbled by lips too dry to speak it clearly. Perhaps a stone placed beside another stone, in a patch of soil where snow had been cleared with a spade and hope. But no mourning clothes. No procession. Because in a village where everyone had buried someone, grief was not special. It was not an event. It was a layer. Like frost on the eaves. Like the smell of smoke on hair. Something worn, day in and day out, with no ceremony. And the child, now smaller than ever, did not cry loudly. They did not scream. Instead, they became quieter than they had ever been. Their voice, when used, was soft. Polite. Almost too polite, as though afraid their breath might disturb something fragile. They chewed their oats slower. Folded their blanket tighter. Listened longer before speaking. And at night, they curled closer to the fire, though it did not seem to warm them. The village noticed. Of course they did. But in the season of survival, no one had hands free to hold someone else's sorrow. They gave what they could, a crust here, a boiled onion there. A pat on the head. A place by the wall when the wind blew hardest. But mostly, the orphan lived with absence. Not only the absence of a parent. But the absence of noise, of laughter, of someone who would say their name with the kind of familiarity that softens the edges of the world. Still, they endured. Each morning they rose. Pulled on boots stiff with cold. Fed chickens not their own. Gathered water that others would drink. They were useful, and usefulness was its own kind of protection. But not comfort. Comfort was the memory of a lullaby sung near the hearth. It was the sound of a familiar cough, the creak of a certain step on the wooden floor. Gone, now. Sometimes, they spoke to the ash. Not the ashes of the dead, those had long been covered by earth and snow. But the ash in the fireplace. The gray that sat like dusted sorrow beneath the flame. They would watch it swirl when the wind caught the chimney just so. Would whisper to it. Would trace tiny lines in it with a finger when no one watched. Because ash, like grief, is quiet. It doesn't protest. Doesn't leave. And in some strange way, it listened. They didn't ask for their parent to return. The child knew better than to hope for that. But they would whisper things like, "The goat's limping again," or "I burned the porridge this morning." Little things. Daily things. Because the dead had once lived in those same details. In the way they tucked the blanket around a sleeping shoulder. In the way they stirred the stew. In the way they hummed a tune that never had a name. And so the child carried them forward, not with monuments or tales, but with mimicry. With memory stitched into motion. They stirred the stew the same way. Tucked the blanket just so. Hummed, sometimes, when alone. And the village let them be. Because the village had seen it before, that transformation from child to ghost wearer. The way sorrow didn't age a person so much as fold them in. But sometimes, on long, cold nights, someone would place a hand on the orphan's back as they passed. Not speak. Just a press of palm. Just enough to say, "I see it. I see you." And in spring, when it came, if it came, the child did not bloom. They did not run through the fields like others. But they did stand taller. Held water steadier. Tied knots with more certainty. And sometimes, when the fire was low and the room was empty, they would speak aloud, as though to someone just in the next room. And the ash would stir. And the grief, still there, would feel, for a moment, less sharp. Because some griefs do not shout. They whisper. And they stay. But in staying, they become part of the breath. Of the hand that stirs the soup. Of the eyes that watch the sky. And so the orphan lived. Not loudly. But deeply. And through their quiet, the dead lived, too. There are seasons that come with ceremony, with colors and celebration. But not March. Not in the croft, and not in the glens. March didn't arrive with birdsong or blossom. It crept in like a thief. Wet-footed and uncertain. A trickle, not a trumpet. And in its wake came something worse than silence, false hope. The snow that had once blanketed the hills like an old wool cloak began to slip away. Not all at once. A patch of brown earth here. A trickle from a roof edge there. A stone uncovered on a slope. But no song accompanied it. No warmth. Only the slow, sodden undoing of winter's grip. At first, it felt like mercy. The wind no longer stung the cheeks so sharply. Breath no longer showed in every word. Children, those who had made it through the dark, stepped outside longer. Looked at the sky more. Dug at the softening ground with sticks and wondered aloud what might grow. But beneath the thaw was something more treacherous than frost, mud. Not a thin layer. Not a nuisance. A season of its own. A living, sucking thing that clung to boots, pulled at skirts, swallowed wheels and hooves and small hands. It made the ground impassable, the work exhausting, and the mornings endlessly damp. Mud got into everything. It soaked straw roofs until the drips returned. It seeped into wool, into firewood, into bones. It blurred the line between inside and outside. Between what was supposed to be dry and what never quite was again. Children came home with knees blackened and shoes lost. Men cursed under their breath as they tried to lift carts sunk axle deep. And women wrung out cloth that never seemed to dry, fingers red and raw with the effort. The croft walls, once frozen hard, now wept with condensation. Mold took to corners like unwelcome guests. Everything smelled faintly of rot and river and the past. This was the price of spring. No one welcomed it openly. Not yet. The fires still burned, but not from necessity, from resistance. Against damp. Against creeping illness. Against the return of work too soon for muscles still weary. And with March came illness of another kind. Not the brutal freeze of winter's fevers, but the slow kind, coughs that settled deep, stomachs that churned from spoiled food, skin that erupted in sores from damp and dirty linens. The healers returned, but more often now. Their bundles of herbs still potent, but stretched thin. The ash once blessed now used too quickly. Sleep became strange again. Not from cold this time, but from dreams brought on by damp. Hallucinations whispered through the croft in the nights, visions of planting too early, of ruined crops, of children sinking into the earth itself. Mothers would wake and check for fever, only to find a child perfectly still, only sleeping, but breathing like a whisper, shallow and slow. Some days, the clouds hung so low it felt as though the sky itself had collapsed onto the hills. Visibility faded. Familiar paths turned foreign. And so, some stayed in. Curled around the hearth not for warmth, but for direction. Just to have a center in the haze. There was something worse than hunger in March, fatigue. A weariness that wasn't just in the limbs, but in the soul. The kind that asked, was this really the end of winter, or just a trick of time? Could it return again tomorrow with snow? Could all this melting be undone? Because that had happened before. Old ones remembered. They always did. They told stories, quietly, without wanting to frighten, but with the calm certainty of lived truth, of blizzards in April. Of lambs born into mud and dying before morning. Of planting too soon, and losing everything to a late frost. Their voices, brittle but steady, cut through the illusion of safety. Hope was a fragile thing in March. It had to be rationed like oats or firewood. Given only in small doses, a warm breeze here, a bird's call there, and never trusted fully. The rivers swelled from the thaw, yes, but with them came floods. Crofts built too close to a stream found their hearths wet, their bedding soaked, their food washed away. And no one could afford that. Even gathering firewood, once a cold but reliable task, became treacherous. The forest floors were slick, the banks of streams unstable. One wrong step, and a foot could be broken, a life changed. There were no spare limbs in March. And so the work resumed, but with caution. Fields were poked at, not tilled. Seeds were counted, not sown. Roofs were checked for leaks, but not yet patched. Nothing was begun fully. Everything awaited a sign. And yet, there were moments. Small, hidden things that whispered of a future. A snowdrop bloomed beneath a hedge. The tiniest green shoot on a bare branch. The sound of a bird, not just flying, but singing. And the sun, still low, but lingering just a breath longer than yesterday. These things didn't bring joy, exactly. But they brought a kind of remembering, that life would return. That color would return. That mud, eventually, would harden into earth again. And that earth could be planted. Still, it was not yet time. March, in medieval Scotland, was not a season of hope. It was a season of not yet. Of nearly. Of between. It was when the snow surrendered, but the sun did not win. When the people stirred, but did not rise. When the land softened, but did not give. And in that strange in-between, survival meant patience. Not action. Not celebration. Just waiting. And so they waited, in silence, in motion, in the muck of what came after winter, but before life. March did not bring joy. But it brought a lesson. That even suffering can thaw. But only slowly. It did not come with banners. No horns were blown. No blades were raised. This revolt was quieter than all that, softer than a whisper, gentler than frost on a windowsill. And yet it stirred beneath the skin of Scotland like sap rising unseen beneath a still barren tree. It began, as many things did in those days, with bread. Or rather, the absence of it. After winter's long reign, with its cold that clawed at joints and turned every morning into a test of endurance, spring brought hunger's echo rather than its end. The larders were near empty. The salted meats, if they had them at all, were now gristle and bone. Oat cakes, once dull but sufficient, had vanished months ago. And so the dream of bread returned, fresh, warm, soft, and not imagined but real. They dreamed of it in the crofts, where only water and onion skins simmered. They dreamed of it in the monasteries, where monks lowered their eyes and said little of the buttery loaves resting in their cellars. They dreamed of it even in the manor houses, though theirs was not the dream of absence, but of indulgence. And with the bread, came the salt. White, bright, precious. Not just for taste, but for life itself, to preserve meat, to treat wounds, to make the unbearable slightly more bearable. It was both flavor and currency. In some villages, a single handful could buy you a promise, if not a meal. Bread and salt. Simple things. Unremarkable to those who had never lived without them. But to the peasant, they were sacred. So when even these things began to vanish, not because the earth could not yield them, but because they were claimed first by the tithe, by the tax, by the hand that took before it gave, something deep and hidden inside began to smolder. Not a rebellion of swords, but of refusal. They began to hide what little they had, not from thieves, but from the church. From the Lord. From the reeve who came knocking with his ledger and his demands. They buried root vegetables under the floorboards. They salted turnips and kept them in hollowed stones instead of barrels. They passed oat flour hand to hand, in silence, in darkness, after prayers had ended. A new kind of faith began to grow, not in saints or kings, but in one another. Children were taught not just to pray before meals, but to keep their mouths shut after. Women stitched secret pouches into their skirts. Men hunted not deer, but rabbits, quiet, quick, unrecorded. And all of this, every bit, was treason. But treason with no banner. Because in medieval Scotland, revolt didn't always come with fire. Sometimes it came with silence. And silence spread. In one village, a baker stopped selling to the manor. Said his flour had spoiled. In another, a woman began tending her neighbor's sick child, while her own stomach growled. In another still, the parish priest began turning his back when he saw grain being smuggled under cloaks after Vespers. They weren't radicals. They weren't warriors. They were cold, tired people, who had simply reached the end of their giving. This was not an uprising that would be written in scrolls. No songs would be sung about it. No victories carved into stone. But it mattered. Because each bowl of broth not tithed was a resistance. Each child fed before the steward's horse was watered was a defiance. Each handful of salt kept from the tax cart was a declaration. And that made it powerful. In the eyes of the nobility, it was sin. In the eyes of the church, it was theft. But in the eyes of the hearth, in the trembling candlelight of a croft, it was survival. Bread and salt became more than sustenance. They became symbols. Of dignity. Of the right to eat without permission. Of the simple belief that those who toiled the soil should taste its yield first. Some called it foolish. Others called it dangerous. But to the peasant, it was the only revolution left. And it spread without meetings, without messengers. Just by necessity. And by a hunger that had gone too long unanswered. Even when caught, even when punished, there was no shame. Because when all you've ever given is your labor, and all you've ever received is less than enough, then even a spoonful of saved grain feels like justice. That spring, no castles fell. No kings were toppled. But mothers smiled at the first oatcake they'd made in secrecy. And fathers stood watch at night not for wolves, but for taxmen. And children, for the first time in months, licked their fingers after eating. It was not a feast. It was not a war. It was something harder. It was endurance turned to action. A quiet revolt, measured not in blood, but in crumbs saved, and salt kept. And for a moment, it was enough. The abbey rose on a slight hill, its silhouette more a shape than a structure, stone softened by moss, cloisters hidden beneath creeping fog. It was no grand cathedral of Europe, no golden tower wrapped in incense and glory. It was rough. Simple. Built by calloused hands. And yet to those on the fringe of survival, the shepherd without flock, the widow without name, the bastard without land, it was the faintest promise in a land that rarely offered any. The bread came warm from ovens fueled by peat and pine, baked in silence by monks who whispered their psalms over dough and flame. It wasn't fluffy or fine. The crust was rough, the middle dense. But it steamed when torn, and smelled of roasted barley and salt and life. And to the marginal, to those who lived mostly in the forgotten folds of Scotland's wild, it was more than food. It was mercy. You didn't ask for it, not in words. You showed up. Hungry. Weather-worn. Humbled by the wind. And if the brothers saw fit, they would open the side gate, not the front, never the front, and lead you through a narrow passage, where the smoke clung to low beams and the air smelled of old grain and wax. They would hand you a small loaf, sometimes with a smear of lard, other times a knob of hard cheese. Nothing more. No invitation to stay. But they would nod. Just once. And the gate would close again. To be marginal in medieval Scotland wasn't unusual. It was nearly the norm. Most folk hovered just above collapse, tied to land that wasn't theirs, harvests they couldn't keep, and systems they couldn't name but which held them tight all the same. But the truly marginal, the ones who fell through even that thin net, lived like breath on glass. Here, then gone. Some were wanderers. Some were maimed. Some were women turned out after childbirth, or men broken by war. Some were simply old, too slow to work, too proud to beg. They wandered crofts and glens, following old tracks, guided by smoke trails and rumors of generosity. And among all these rumors, one name returned again and again, the abbey with the warm bread. It had no true name that the marginal used. Not St. Columba's, or Our Lady of Light. Just the abbey. A place that didn't ask too many questions. That gave enough to last the next day. Sometimes that was all one needed, one day more. It was a gamble, of course. The monks were not endlessly kind. They had their own limits, their own hierarchy of worth. A face too wild, too dirty, too bruised by drink might be turned away. A known thief, even hungrier than the rest, would find the gate barred. But to those who knew how to approach, eyes down, voice low, shoes off at the threshold, there was usually a loaf waiting. And the thing about warm bread, when you haven't had it in weeks, is that it breaks you. Not loudly. Not with sobs or prayers. Just in the way your hands tremble as they tear it. The way you hold the crust close to your mouth to catch the steam. The way the first bite doesn't even register as food, but as safety. Warm bread is forgiveness. Warm bread is being seen. The abbey itself was nothing to look at. Its stones had shifted. Its roof sagged. Its sheep grazed more freely than its monks. But its oven never cooled. Even when the firewood ran low, they baked. Sometimes with mixed grain. Sometimes with bark ground into flour. But always something. And in a land where everything was earned through labor or lineage, the gift of bread, not bought, not worked for, was radical. It whispered of another world. Not a better one, perhaps. But a softer one. Where hunger wasn't a verdict. Where mercy didn't require merit. Where the smallest kindness could survive, tucked between psalms and soot. The marginal began to form a network, silent and loose. They left markings on stones, bundles of straw near gates, piles of pebbles by trails, to show who had eaten, who had been turned away, which brother gave bread with a smile, and which one did not. It became its own quiet map of survival. And for the monks, too, there was a shift. Though sworn to silence, some found comfort in this ritual, this daily moment where their labor turned into sustenance, and their prayers found form in crust and crumb. They, too, were men displaced by the world, retreated, tucked into robes not just for God, but for refuge. And so, when they handed over bread to the marginal, they weren't offering charity. They were offering kinship. Even the act of giving was a kind of confession. One monk, Brother Rian, began to set aside an extra loaf each dawn. Not part of the day's ration. Not for the abbey's stores. Just one more, hidden behind the coals, meant for someone who hadn't yet arrived. I do not know who they are, he whispered once to the oven fire. But they are always coming. That loaf was rarely wasted. It found its way to a child with no shoes, or an elder with no teeth, or a mother with too many mouths and too few hands. It always arrived where it was most needed. And when it didn't, the crows took it. Or the foxes. But even that felt right. Because in a world that often hoarded and withheld, the idea that bread could simply exist for someone, somewhere, without question, without transaction, was enough to keep people walking. It gave them one more day. And in medieval Scotland, one more day was everything. So if you ever find yourself at the edge of some map, wind-chilled and weary, remember, there was once a small abbey on a hill, where monks baked rough bread in a cracked oven. Where those with no place left to go found, if not welcome, then at least warmth. And sometimes, that was enough. The wind might have taken roofs and roads, but it never took the old songs. In the crofts and among the hills, when the fires burned low and mouths were too tired to speak of hunger, someone would hum. Just a thread of melody, old and cracked as the hearthstones, passed down not in parchment but in breath. These were not songs sung for celebration or show. They were bone songs, root songs. Woven into the very act of staying alive. You might hear one begin when someone stirred a pot too thin to feed a family. Or while someone wrapped their child's feet in rags for another cold walk to gather sticks. And the voice wouldn't always be strong. Sometimes it wavered like a candle. But it was enough. Enough to remember that someone had come before. And someone might still come after. The old ways weren't written. That was the point. The ink belonged to kings and priests. But the tune of a grandmother's lullaby, the rhythm of hooves crossing a frostbitten path, the sharp clap of hands against knees during a ceilidh by firelight, these were held in the marrow. They were remembered even when names were not. There were songs about cows and grief, about green hills that hadn't been green in a decade, about saints who could bless the crops if you sang their name just right. There were songs for births and songs for deaths, though sometimes they were the same melody, just slowed or softened. The spirits heard them, too. Not the saints of Rome, clad in gilded robes and doctrine. The old spirits, the ones that lived in stones and streams, in broom closets and blackbirds. To the church, they were superstition. But to the peasant with frostbitten toes and a leaking roof, they were insurance. Tiny prayers to things older than cathedrals. A bit of bread left on the sill at night. A whisper before stepping into the woods. A ribbon tied to the oldest tree. A muttered verse before pulling a root from the earth. These were acts of reverence, not for power, but for coexistence. And while the bell of the chapel tolled through the valley, commanding attention in Latin, the real listening happened in silence. A child noticing the way the crows flew that morning. A woman studying the way the frost clung to the threshold. A man stopping just long enough to thank the wind for not stealing his breath. In these spaces, the old ways lived. The songs were often nonsense, on the surface. Half in Gaelic, half in dreams. But they held things the people couldn't say directly. Like the way grief never left you, only changed its seat at the table. Or the way hunger made you see God in a crust of bread. Sometimes, songs were all that passed down. When a father died in the fields and his tools were too rusted to keep, when a mother passed away and the bairns were sent to different homes, when the home itself crumbled under snow, still, the song might survive. One child humming as they fell asleep in a stranger's loft. Another tapping the rhythm on their knee years later by a new fire. In this way, a family stayed alive, note by note. The spirits, those wild, listening presences, were said to follow the music, too. It made them gentle. It reminded them the people hadn't forgotten. And so maybe, just maybe, the weather would break. Or the pigs would fatten. Or the fever would pass. And if it didn't, the people still sang. Because sometimes defiance didn't look like rebellion. It looked like melody. It looked like a crone with no teeth and a broken back still tapping her spoon against the hearthstone in rhythm. It looked like a widower, eyes glazed from loss, still humming the tune his wife used to murmur while mending. It looked like a girl with no shoes dancing in a ring of frost, because the song told her to. The church tried, gently and then forcefully, to hush the old ways. To erase the songs that mentioned spirits or hills with names older than Christ. But the people were careful. They sang in kitchens, not pews. They danced behind barns, not beneath towers. And they wove the saints into the old songs, disguising them just enough. Saint Bridget might have once been a goddess, but now she watched over the lambing season. A fair trade. Even the monks, strict and scholarly, would sometimes pause at the sound of a tune drifting from the village. Something about it stirred them. Something wordless, nameless. A thread to a time before pens and power. The old ways weren't about nostalgia. No one romanticized poverty. They were about survival. Spiritual survival. Emotional survival. The kind of strength that doesn't shout, but hums. To hold on to a song when everything else has gone, the cattle, the family, the future, is to tell the frost it hasn't won. To tell the king he hasn't taken everything. To tell God, or the spirits, or just the world itself, I am still here. And that is no small thing. Even now, if you walk the highlands or the glens, and the wind catches you just right, you might hear it. A sound with no source. A woman's voice, or maybe a child's. A few simple notes. Wavering. Ancient. A song that doesn't ask for attention. Just remembrance. And if you close your eyes, you might see her. Wrapped in wool, barefoot on stone. Humming by a fire that barely burns. And yet, she sings. Because that's how the old ways stay. Not by being shouted from rooftops, but by being whispered into sleep. And if you're lucky, you'll carry that song with you, too. Above the fields, beyond the frostbitten roofs and the muffled crofts, the sky stretched like a cold cathedral, vaulted, ancient, and indifferent. The stars over Stirling were neither gentle nor cruel. They simply were. And the people looked up. In a world where most things came from the earth, potatoes, peat, trouble, and toil, the sky was a place of contradiction. It offered nothing tangible. It yielded no warmth, no harvest. Yet still, it gave something. A shape to dreams, perhaps. A place to store the hopes that had no home in the soil. Children were the first to stare at it with wonder. Wrapped in wool that smelled faintly of sheep and smoke, tucked into their mothers' sides, they would crane their necks just before sleep. Their fingers might be red with cold, their bellies half empty, but their eyes still widened at the sight of stars. It was the one thing no lord could own, no priest could cage, and no winter could freeze. Stirling itself, with its castle on the rock, stood like a sentinel beneath that sky. The town pulsed quietly through the seasons, a place of kings and markets, of taxes and sermons. But when night fell and the fires burned low, all of it faded into silhouettes. The stone walls, the dirt tracks, the low groans of cattle, all sank into shadow. And above it all, the stars emerged. Some said they were holes poked in the firmament by the saints, letting heaven's light shine through. Others claimed they were the eyes of old gods, watching still. The church warned against such talk, of course, preferring angels and order. But even the priests looked up sometimes, longer than they meant to. For the peasant, the night sky was not just a canvas. It was a kind of escape. By day, life was small and hard. The hands chopped, the backs bent, the mouths mumbled. People spoke little, for language was taxed too, each word had to justify itself in the cold. But at night, under the stars, thoughts swelled. You could dream bigger in the dark. There was a boy once who stood barefoot in the mud, watching the moon reflect in a puddle. He had no shoes, and no father either, taken by sickness the winter before. But he had a question burning in his chest: what if the moon watched him, too? And there was the girl, barely 13, kneeling in straw as she fed a dying goat. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from knowing too early how fragile things could be. But when she looked up, the stars blinked back like 1,000 tiny promises. She whispered a story to them. One of her own making. These were the quiet revolutions. Not with pitchforks or torches, but with eyes that dared to hope. Hope was a strange thing in medieval Scotland. It had to be subtle, cautious. You couldn't hope for too much, too fast. The church told you what to hope for, heaven, mostly. And even that required obedience, tithe, penance. But the stars made no such demands. They didn't ask for prayer. They just existed. Some found their dead among them. I saw my da up there last night, a boy would say to his sister as they shivered under the same lice-riddled blanket. Right there. That one. And the girl would nod, not because she believed in ghosts, but because it felt good to say he wasn't just dirt now. Others read omens. If a star fell, someone would die. If a cloud passed across the moon, the harvest would fail. It wasn't science. It was survival, cloaked in story. Because to assign meaning to the sky was to take a sliver of control back from a world that gave so little. The constellations had names, though not always the ones in the monks' books. The belt of Orion might become the butcher's chain. Ursa Major, the great, so they named the stars not from Latin texts, but from memory and need. From lives lived close to the ground but eyes that still lifted. In the darkest winters, when snow fell sideways and the wind carried more teeth than breath, the sky was often the only thing untouched. Roofs collapsed, animals perished, fingers blackened, but the stars stayed. They became companions. Cold ones, yes, but consistent. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone would sing to them. A lullaby, maybe. Or a psalm that had forgotten its words and learned new ones. The kind of tune that didn't need an audience, just a place to go. The sound would rise into the night, past the chimney smoke and frostbitten thatch, dissolving into the black above. The castle lights in Stirling flickered dimly then. The nobles behind thick walls and thicker cloaks never knew what it meant to send your breath skyward in hope. But down in the crofts, they did. They had to. It was a way of staying human when life asked too much. Some would point out a particular star to their children, every night, like a ritual. That one there, the bright one, if it's shining, will be all right. And even if it wasn't true, it gave the child something to anchor to. Something higher than the rats and the rot and the daily gruel. As spring approached, timid and soggy, the sky softened. The stars blinked more slowly, the moon glowed gentler. The dreams below them didn't grow bolder, just clearer. Now the people could imagine planting again. Could imagine lambs. Could imagine stories told not from sorrow, but from survival. And Stirling, that old place of kings and conflict, exhaled under the same sky. It had seen war. Seen rebellion. Seen famine. But above it all, the stars had watched, unchanged. That night sky held every dream the people dared not speak aloud. It held mothers whispering names to unborn babies. Boys imagining what lay beyond the river. Girls wondering what it meant to feel warm and safe and seen. It held the dreams that could not be written, but were nonetheless real. Because sometimes, when you have nothing left, the only place left to dream, is up. And under the night sky over Stirling, that was enough. There is no announcement when spring arrives in Scotland, no sudden thaw or fanfare. Just the smallest betrayal of winter, a drip of water down a stone wall, the softness of a breeze that doesn't bite. The frost still clings to the thatch. The mornings remain cold enough to turn breath to fog. But underneath, a quiet change begins. It is not color that comes first, but smell. Damp earth, rich and familiar, like something long lost and barely remembered. The scent of soil waking up. And where before there was only brown and gray and the weight of cold air, now there is a hint, just a whisper, of green. The first blades of it are timid. They push up near the edges of paths, where feet haven't packed the mud too tightly. Or beside the hearth's waste pile, where warm water was tossed through the winter. They rise like secrets. Not confident, not yet. But alive. And for the people of the croft, it is enough. Because to survive winter is no small thing. It is not merely a matter of enduring weather. It is enduring hunger, silence, fear, and the near madness of repetition. Waking and sleeping and waking again to the same cold walls, the same low fire, the same empty pots. When green returns, it doesn't just mean the world is growing again. It means you are still here to see it. Children are the first to notice. They crouch beside puddles, their fingers still red from cold, and point to the smallest green sprout. It's real, they say, as if spring might have been a story grown too tired to believe. A bud on a branch becomes cause for celebration. A patch of moss is a marvel. The world, it seems, has not forgotten them after all. The animals, too, stir differently. The hens begin to fuss and chatter more. Their combs regain color. The goat limps less. Even the old oxen lift their heads higher, smelling something new on the air. They don't know dates or seasons. But they feel it in their bones, the danger is passing. In the croft, the mood softens, not dramatically, but gently, like the sun that lingers a little longer in the late afternoon. A crack in the door is allowed to stay open. The coals are not guarded as jealously. People speak in full sentences again, not just necessity. And though the larder remains near empty, the stomach stops growling quite so loudly. The peat fires are still needed. The night still cuts. But now, a pot of water left outside does not freeze solid. Now, the hens lay more than one egg a week. Now, someone dares to sing again, just under their breath, just while chopping wood, but still, a song. It's not joy, exactly. Not yet. It is relief. And from relief, the first laughter in weeks. One morning, a girl finds a wildflower beside the stone path. It is too early, surely, and she should not touch it. But she does. Just the tip of one finger. She doesn't pluck it. She leaves it for someone else to see. By afternoon, 5 more people have gone out of their way to stand and look at it. A single bloom. A reminder. Food is still scarce. There's no denying that. But someone trades dried nettles for a heel of bread. Someone else brings a handful of wild garlic, grinning like he's brought gold. These are not meals, but they are moments. Moments where life feels less like punishment, and more like possibility. The sun creeps higher now. It casts shadows at angles not seen in months. Shadows that suggest movement, change, forwardness. The children begin to leave their cloaks behind when they go outside. The elders let the smoke holes stay open longer. The air, once the enemy, is becoming a friend again. A few brave souls begin to turn the soil. Their hands still ache from winter, their backs not yet mended. But they lift their tools, wooden, worn, patched, and begin the long work of preparing for planting. It is not immediate, not easy. But it is done in hope. They sow not only seeds, but survival. A patch of land, scraped flat by wind and hooves, is poked and prodded until it agrees to open again. A line is scratched, a seed dropped. No guarantee, of course. There never is. But the act alone is a kind of faith. Faith that the land remembers how to give. At night, the stars seem less distant. The sky is still deep and black, but now the moon is watched for its fullness, not its omens. The air doesn't burn in the lungs. A body can step outside for a moment without shaking. And in those moments, they look at each other again, not as burdens, not as mouths to feed, but as fellow survivors. The woman who gave up her share of soup for the baby. The boy who fed the hens when no one told him to. The man who stayed awake to guard the fire. They do not celebrate openly. That is not the way of their world. But they nod to each other a little more often. They speak names a little softer. They begin to plan, however cautiously, for tomorrow. Because spring has not arrived in full. But green has returned. And in that green lies a kind of quiet triumph. The triumph of having endured. The triumph of planting one more seed, boiling one more pot of nettles, mending one more sleeve. The triumph of saying, without ever needing to speak it aloud, we are still here. And though life will never be easy, never free of cold, or war, or grief, it has moved. It has turned. The wheel rolls on, and they have not fallen beneath it. In the early morning mist, someone notices the birdsong. It's not loud. Not urgent. But it is there. And that alone is reason enough to rise. They do not speak, but they remain. Tall, weather-worn, older than memory. The standing stones. To walk among them is to feel a hush deeper than silence, a hush that has waited for centuries, unmoved by the rise of kings or the crumbling of cottages. These stones stand in sheep fields and fog-soaked hills. They are not polished or carved. Just present. As though placed there by hands too long gone to name. The peasants of medieval Scotland did not build them. They inherited them. Much like hunger, or land they did not own. Still, the stones were known. Not understood, no, but known in the way the sky is known, or the wind, or sorrow. They had names passed down in whispers. The sleeping one. The watcher. The sisters. Each name a guess. Each name a prayer. Or a warning. They marked boundaries that no lord had drawn. Places where the soil turned odd underfoot. Where birds did not settle. Where one walked a little faster, even in daylight. And when winter returned, as it always did, those who passed by them pulled their cloaks tighter, even if the wind had gone still. Because the stones remembered. They remembered the dead. The lost. The sacrifices no longer sung in church halls. They bore no crosses, but they were holy. In their own, older way. Before books. Before Latin. Before the crown. They had watched people kneel long before the first priest arrived. Some folk said the stones warmed when you leaned against them. Others said they pulsed. Not with life, exactly. But with presence. No one asked them for answers. You didn't talk to a stone. But sometimes, if you were alone, and if your belly was empty, and if grief sat too close, you might sit beside one. Just to be near something that had endured. Something that had not broken. And when the wind cried through the glens and the heather bent low, you might even feel less alone. It wasn't comfort in the way a fire comforts. The stones gave no heat. No bread. No coin. But they gave scale. They said, without words, you are small. You are temporary. But you are part of this. And that was its own kind of comfort. Some claimed the stones moved. Not walked or danced, but shifted. Just a fraction. Just enough to notice, if you returned in spring and stood in the same place. A tilt, maybe. A lean. A shadow that fell where it hadn't before. No one tested them. No one dared carve their initials. Even the cruelest boys dared not throw stones at the stones. They were too old to defy. Too old not to believe in. And so they stood, through frost, through famine, through raids and prayers and generations forgotten. The croft would crumble. The barn would rot. The tree would fall in a storm. But the stones would still be there, waiting for a footstep to pass by again. Waiting to be noticed by someone who had lost too much to speak. And when they were noticed, they gave back nothing. Only presence. Only being. And what more, really, is needed in the darkest months? To sit in stillness. To feel your ribs with your own fingers and know they are still there. To breathe beside something that cannot die. In some winters, the snow would gather around the base of the stones like cloaks. In others, the wind would strip them clean, leaving them naked and gray, the sky breaking behind them in long tiers of cloud. The stars above them seemed closer. The moon, sharper. A thin kind of silver truth. No bishop owned that truth. No warlord taxed it. Only the stones knew it. And those who kept the old stories, old even then, said that when all else fell, when the last bell stopped ringing and the last hearth grew cold, the stones would still stand. Watching. Not judging. just watching. And maybe that was the deepest terror of all, that nothing we did would matter to them. Not prayers, not murders, not love. They had seen it all before. And yet, we visited them still. Left pebbles near their feet. Or bits of wool. Or strands of hair from a new child's head. Tiny gestures of respect. A nod to the unknowable. And sometimes, in spring, the moss on their sides would blush green again, a faint sign that even the oldest could still feel the seasons move. So when someone died in the depth of winter, and the ground was too hard for digging, they were buried shallow. But they were buried near the stones. Not for protection. But for memory. Because no one remembered the names of the peasants 2 generations back. But the stones would remember. In their own way. Not as names. But as warmth once felt near their base. As footprints long vanished. As tears dropped beside them with no witness. Still they stood. And long after the croft was swallowed by bracken and the last roof beam sagged into ruin, the stones remained. Unclaimed. Untouched. Children found them again, centuries later. Asked what they were. The answers had changed, but the awe had not. Because something that endures is something to be listened to. Even in silence. Especially in silence. So if one cold night, your fire burns low and your thoughts wander far, picture them there, alone on the hillside. The wind curling round them, the frost clutching their shadows. And know that someone once lived nearby. Once slept hungry. Once loved deeply. Once feared the dark and still rose before the dawn. And those people, the ones whose names we'll never know, are not entirely gone. They stood where the stones still stand. And that is something. That is everything.